The dusk settles over the plain before the rivers, a slow purple breathing across the reed beds where the Tigris and Euphrates begin their long conversation. In that hour the city-states of Sumer breathe their own language of clay and smoke, of kiln-fired brick and the groan of ox carts. It is here, amid the silt and the sun-baked courtyards, that an impossible thing finds the human world, not rumor or omen alone, but a tangible seed of ruin that will wear the faces of the living and mock the shape of the dead. Most would flee from the first Marvel zombie outbreak. Subscribe if you dare to step into Sumer's night and face the undead legends yourself. It arrives as a star, or so the shepherds call it, a dark comet with a body like a wound in the sky. They do not have a single word for what falls, only many small names that gather between them in the smoke of the fires: strange stone, black milk, other breath. By the time the watch on the outer palisade raises alarm, the fragment is already coughing powder over a field of barley, and the air tastes of iron and salt for the first night. Priests descend from ziggurat terraces like a layer of white-robed gulls, their fingers stained with clay and ink, their lips moving through litany and list. They interpret not just for kings but for the gods, inscriptions to be made, offerings to be counted, omens to be read, as if the sky had a hand on Sumer's pulse. Yet paper and prayer are not enough for this thing. The fragment hums in the stone, a low voice that is felt in bone rather than heard. The first victims do not scream so much as forget how to remain separate from the world of the living. A herdsman is found kneeling by the canal, his mouth dry and his eyes gone flat, hands motioning as if naming creatures that are not present. He dies beside reeds, and then his hands twitch, reaching not for air but for flesh, a small relapse into hunger that will become the city's quiet terror. News spreads along clay roads like oil. Traders who had bartered grain and lapis speak now in whispers of what they saw on the outskirts, bodies that would not stay buried, fingers digging, mouths seeking more than the grave had promised. The word for plague is old and useful, the word for curse is older still, but no existing ink signs the compound of both, a sickness that eats the line between life and death and wears that eaten line like clothing. Kings do what kings often do in crisis. They summon councils and scribes, they offer rewards and punishments in equal measure, and they place their trust in diviners who will call upon gods to explain what mortal eyes cannot. A king in Uruk commands his artisans to inscribe clay tablets with the shape of the affliction, to fix it in language so that it might be contained. But the more they name it, the less naming seems to help. Words make the pattern known, but patterns are food to whatever force lies within the comet. Temples become battlegrounds in ways the city never meant for them to be. Priests who once guided the dead to the underworld find, one by one, that the dead are not going where they were told. Instead, rites meant to honor and to close suddenly open doors, as if the prayers themselves had become a map leading right back to the thing that will not rest. Incense no longer hides the smell of rot, it highlights it, like oil on water, making sure everyone knows where the stain lies. At first the undead are not many, and the living believe they can surround them with watchmen and stakes. They fashion crude symbols from copper and bone, tying them to doors and setting kiln fire at thresholds. People sleep in shifts, they stand in clotted gears of labor to keep watch, and male and female both learn the meaning of a good blade. Yet hunger is a patient tutor, and the lessons it gives are merciless. The dead learn movement with a terrible economy of want. The mythology that holds a city together begins to dissolve and reconfigure. Names of gods shift on tongues as quickly as the wind changes light. Ereshkigal and Nergal, rulers of the underworld, are called by new epithets, half prayer and half invective. But when petition and blasphemy converge, the gods who once ruled cannot clean what a foreign darkness has spilled across human soil. They are voices in fires and in the mouths of litanists, and occasionally their thundered reply is a small, indifferent gust. Some survivors swear the fragment was not wholly of the sky but carried by a man, by a caravan stowaway who brought an obsidian bead wrapped in linen like a secret. Others insist that a visitor from a sea beyond the horizon crashed into the plain, and his blood fell into the furrows. There will be many stories and many scapegoats, and each will bear a shard of truth as a mirror bears a crack. The black thing came to them, and when it touched human breath a new law began to write itself. It is not only bodies that change but language, and with language the way the people think of kin and community. The living start to categorize the dead into types. Some are slow and stupid, others retain fragments of speech and memory and the capacity to laugh, and a few preserve a cruelty that seems oddly human. The category names are whispered into earthen bowls and folded into prayers, as if by naming the spoil they might snap its thread. A midwife becomes a chronicler of horror by force of necessity, recording each birth, each death, each case where the threshold between the two is violated. Her hands are stained not by ink but by things more intimate, the curl of newborn hair, the slackness of a face that used to belong to a friend. She measures the days between life and anorexia of the undead, and she keeps a small ledger of what wards kept infants safe and what lullabies summoned hunger instead. Soldiers are deputized and then demoted to a new task, not conquest and not defense against neighboring cities, but the deterrence of the walking dead themselves. They patrol with torches and spears, their armor clinking like prayer beads, and learn to act quickly, not because of orders but because of the smell of desperation in the nights when everyone is trying to sleep. Battles happen in alleys and courtyards, funerary rites become maneuvers of survival. The plague also alters trade. Caravans that once threaded Mesopotamia become suspicion-laden caravans now, hated for their speed and their capacity to spread whatever lingers in the air. Some city-states close their gates, devolving into pockets of terror, while others trade the undead as a bargaining chip, sending them to the doors of arrival in the hope that the enemy will be weakened. This is old politics wearing a new face, and in this way human brutality collaborates with the curse. At the heart of the matter is hunger, a motif both simple and inexorable. The undead do not seek destruction as a creed, they seek continuance through consumption. They reach for familiar things first, bread, the smell of cooked meat, the warmth of a sleeping child, and then, because appetite expands to fit its object, they hunger for flesh. This expansion of want reshapes moral choices. Who do you save when you cannot save all? There are moments of terrible intimacy when a living person recognizes someone they love in the hungry face of the undead and cannot look away. The mind fills with memory like water into a bowl. Hands that once clasped the same cup now tremble with a different gravity. A woman in the city of Lagash, one of many such women, stands at the doorway of her courtyard as the courtyard's dead move like puppets. She speaks to a loved one turned hollow, naming the child's favorite reed toy, and in that naming the gap becomes an ache so precise it is almost a weapon. Leaders who cling to power attempt to use the undead as instruments of terror, binding them with crude charms to maintain order through fear. They parade them at city gates, caged and muzzled, an argument that obedience is the only guard against what waits beyond. But such spectacles only teach the living that the undead can be harnessed for cruelty too, and they seed an ethics of calculation which will outlive the initial outbreak. The architects of Sumer, those who build walls and plan drains, find new purpose in a suddenly more fragile civilization. Ziggurats are reinforced, channels deepen to carry away not only water but the scent of decay. Artists once tasked with scenes of harvest and heroics now etch reliefs of the undead, faces half mimed and half real, so that the story will not be lost when the tongues of survivors dry out. In clay and in mortar, the people try to speak forever. Sometimes the city finds a temporary remedy, a ritual that seems to hold the tide back for a season. A supplication is made, a human-shaped doll is burned on the altar, and for a while fewer corpses rise. A woman named Inanna, not the goddess but a priestess sharing the name, uses a braid of lapis and cedar to form a lattice around the most afflicted district, and within that lattice the dead do not seem to find a way. The relief is fragile and smells of smoke, however, because when rituals rely on material and not myth, they are liable to be broken by simple hunger. Remarkably, a scholar among the scribes begins to make sense of the fragment's pattern by comparing it to older tablets, lists of illnesses, hymns, and a few fragments that look like maps of otherworldly visitors. He posits that the comet, the bead, or whatever arrived might be inflicted with a transmissible quality not unlike the pests that have haunted humankind for ages, but alien in its diet. His notes are meticulous. He draws diagrams in charcoal and pushes them into the hands of kings. Some listen and some destroy the diagrams because knowledge threatens established ritual. There are moments of quiet heroism that history often forgets. A mid-rank scribe stays up nights copying texts to preserve knowledge of how certain wards once worked, while his neighbor feeds the mute children of the fallen. An old brewer spends his last ounces of grain to distract a small pack of undead from a family hiding in a storeroom. These acts are small stars in a terrible sky, and in them the human pulse resists complete erasure. The plague mutates as plagues do, and not merely in biology but in method. The undead learn stealth when they must. They abandon brute force for cunning. They hide in shadows, they mimic the voices they once loved, and at times they pretend to be bread and water and return a life meal in exchange for a moment alone with a sleeping family. The living learn to distrust silence as much as noise, and sleep becomes a rare commodity. Cuneiform tablets capture not only acts and names but moods. They record how laughter thinned like bread dough, how songs changed their keys, how love letters turned to lists of supplies. Poets who survive the first years break their lines into shorter breaths, and their meters take on a staccato like someone constantly checking doors. Their verse becomes a way to administer attention and to refuse the oblivion of resignation. Some cities mount a counteroffensive of a different sort. They decide to bury the fragment itself, to hide its memory deep beneath foundation clay with spells that are both practical and desperate. Men and women dig down until their backs break in a single bend, placing the stone in a pit weighted with lead and sealed under a ziggurat's lowest step. They speak the names of the dead aloud as a promise that to bury the thing is to bury the chance for it to rise again. Yet winter comes and with it fatigue, and with fatigue come errors. A gate left ajar, an unguarded tomb, a priest misled by grief, all of them become new openings through which the plague returns. Ancient mechanics of supply and demand reassert themselves. If the living must trade with neighboring towns, then the exchange of grain and salt also exchanges what clings to linen and bone. The curse learns the channels of commerce and uses them as if they were veins in the earth. Not all deaths turn the same way. Many corpses do not rise at all, and this uneven response becomes a source of both hope and terror. Families cannot tell which bodies will return, and so the custom of burial gains new rites that look like superstitions but are more practical, particular knots in the shrouds, certain oils rubbed over mouths, tiny weapons bound to wrists. These methods are not foolproof, and they often function as ritual insurance more than cure. In some quarters, practitioners of the old healing arts set aside their professional ethics in favor of invention. They brew salves that sting in linen steeped in poppy and bitter herbs, applying them to the faces of those thought primed for transition. Sometimes their concoctions slow the change, sometimes they hasten it. The ambiguity of their success weighs upon them, and their hands come to tremble precisely because they are the ones who wanted to help. The undead themselves show a peculiar pattern of memory and obsession. Some seek the river, as if water were a magnet for whatever emptiness animates them. Others haunt the granaries, pawing at clay jars as if the shape of scarcity is a prayer they must repeat. A small group develops an almost ritualized behavior of forming circles in ruined courtyards, their faces turned up as if listening to a hymn that no living ear can hear. Their actions suggest there is a script somewhere that they follow in fragments, a story of hunger that has its own grammar. Scribes attempt to codify these appearances, to make the undead legible so that opponents might be predictable. They draw images of gates and stances and label them with a utilitarian precision that brings comfort by way of definition. These codices are used by kitchens, markets, and temples alike, and they travel in the hands of people who will die but not before they teach others how to point out the dead by posture alone. Among the philosophical consequences is a new idea about the afterlife. If a person can return tethered to hunger, what then of the concept of the soul? Debate rages among the literate and the religious, producing arguments both doctrinal and crude. Some maintain the undead are empty shells borrowed by a malevolent intent, others claim they are souls denied rest. The debate becomes less theoretical when someone you love returns different at dawn. Young people adapt more quickly than their elders. They invent protections that are less pious and more practical, whistles fashioned from bone that startle a dead to pause, mirror discs that confuse sight, and a system of mutual aid that passes through neighborhoods with alacrity. Teenagers become adept at reading the small tells of a hovel that might be harboring the virus of walking death. These survival practices will, later on, be remembered as folklore and practical wisdom fused into one. Some priests turn the plague into a liturgy of power, claiming to control the undead through sacrament and dominance. They gather the fearful, offering demonstrations of control that are filled with smoke and ghastly pageantry. At first it seems to work, or at least to mollify terror, then it becomes clear that spectacle can be a dangerous teacher because it obscures the practical measures that actually protect life. The economic fallout reshapes the way Sumer thinks about value. Grain hoarded to avoid famine becomes the currency of life, and in time people recalibrate their priorities. The artisan of fine lapis is less esteemed than the person who can keep water clean. Whole crafts change, pottery styles decline because no one has leisure to paint them, and those who once made luxury goods now fashion tools to keep watch. In this way the plague alters aesthetics by redefining what is necessary. Not all artifacts of this period are purely utilitarian, many carry a heavy weight of mourning. Fez-like amulets engraved with names that did not survive the fire become reliquaries of sorrow. Mothers weave lists of names into woolen wraps so that each sleeping child is literally surrounded by memory. The act of remembering becomes itself a precaution against being unmade. As the years pass, a different kind of resilience is glimpsed. Cities begin to exchange best practices rather than blame. They open markets in ways that allow for safer trade. They send emissaries who specialize in containment. A convoy of healers, armed with the latest of the surviving recipes for warding, travels from city to city documenting what works. These caravans bear brittle hope like a portable sun. But hope is always precarious. A single breach, often from within, undoes months of careful quarantine. A festival where people let down their vigil, a wedding that brings together too many tired hands, these are the predictable tragedies of a community under strain. Grief, predictably, becomes cyclical. The city learns a rhythm of tightening, releasing, and then tightening again. Burial customs morph into a new litany of instruction that even children begin to teach one another. Songs are shortened to include lines about knots and particular herbs. Plays become exercises in training for watch duty. Childhood itself is condensed by experience. Games mimic sieges, and dolls are often made without heads so that children come to terms with the possibility of loss in a less cinematic way. The undead, for their part, are not monolithic. In the recesses of their skeletal craving, some old social distinctions persist. A former scribe jerks toward a stack of tablets as if memory will fill him again. A cook seeks the smell of a particular stew. These residues of identity make the undead both appalling and tragically recognizable, as if a song could be played on a ruined instrument and still call to the listener's memory. At the same time, the curse seems to feed on the structures of violence already present in human societies. Where leaders used to impose taxes, they now levy corvées of guarding. Where armies once expanded borders, they are now used to cordon neighborhoods. The plague reveals and amplifies existing inequalities, because those with more resources can pay for safer quarters and better wards. Those without means become, tragically, the first food and the first shields. There are whispers of otherworldly bargains. A merchant in Umma claims a stranger traded him a formula that will stop the dead for 3 days in exchange for a lapis tablet. A widow tells of a dream where God promised protection in exchange for a ritual oath, and she finds the promise undependable but persuasive enough to bind herself. These bargains blur the lines between devotion and desperation, and they breed a culture of quick packs made in the narrow light of survival. Across generations, the legends of the plague accrete like sediment. Stories told at Hearthside gain monstrous detail with each retelling. The black comet grows larger, the bead becomes a crown, and the undead are described with an increasing array of arbitrary powers. Over time, myth and history braid together, producing a tapestry where facts and fabrications are hard to separate. Yet the core remains. The curse changed how bodies and communities inhabit the world. In quieter corners, scholars of the future will trace echoes of these events into epic literature, finding motifs that resemble the undead in tales of heroes who wrestle with mortality. The epic frameworks, of descent and return, of loss and reclamation, seem to absorb the real terror and translate it into moral metaphors. There is comfort in that translation because myths can hold terror at a distance and teach people how to live with it rather than be destroyed by it. The virus, if it can be called such, leaves physical traces that future hands will misinterpret. A clay tablet inscribed with a recipe for cleansing and that lists ingredients both mundane and bizarre will confuse archaeologists of later ages who are not fluent in the desperate poetry of a plague. Bones found in pits with particular knot patterns will puzzle museum curators who must choose whether to display them as artifacts or as warnings. Those ambiguities will make the ancient story live longer than a simple accounting could. As the immediate crisis stretches from years into a tarnished era, a strange cultural adaptation emerges. A hybrid of ritual and practical life that is neither wholly religious nor entirely scientific by our definitions. The city learns to do both. It recites names and tests potions. It performs offerings and tightens gates. This hybrid becomes the implicit institutional knowledge of Sumer in the time after the first fall of the star. By now, there are hidden libraries beneath staircases and small families of people who keep the memory machinery going. They copy tablets by torchlight and bury their notes in reed baskets, then move them into the hands of the next caretaker. The guardians of memory become a kind of secular priesthood whose role is to ensure that whatever measures once worked are not lost to death and burn, and in this quiet way knowledge becomes a weapon. Not all attempts at containment are peaceful. Some city-states resort to scorched earth tactics, burning neighborhoods in the hope of starving whatever hunger animates the undead. These acts of desperation carry moral costs that ripple long after the fires cool, because the living are often the ones who suffer the most in these purges. Cautionary tales are birthed in the smoke of such decisions, illustrating the times when survival becomes indistinguishable from atrocity. There are brave experiments in architecture designed to obstruct the undead not by killing them but by making their paths useless. Labyrinthine courtyards, false doors, cleverly placed mirrors, and water traps. These designs are born of a pragmatic imagination that sees the city as a machine to be calibrated against hunger. Children who grow up in these cities become adept at moving in such spaces, learning the choreography of survival by intuition. Music changes, too. Drums used to mark the hours become signals and a language of safety, and lullabies incorporate the pattern of knocks that mean danger near, move quietly. Musicians play in minor keys that unsettle the mind into vigilance rather than comfort. In public festivals, artists use rhythm to teach, embedding training in the cadence so that preservation is transmitted without the fatigue of sermon. Meanwhile, some scholars begin to suspect that the fragment's influence was not purely local. They find references to similar anomalies whispered in distant places and collect hearsay into a map of possible contagion. A line is drawn between far cities and the original impact site, a tentative cartography of how a cosmic wound can bleed across continents. This mapping creates a sense of global vulnerability that unsettles the narrower anxieties of city politics. When climate begins to shift in the period, with river levels dipping and droughts pressing like the heel of a hand on the land, the plague's secondary effects intensify. Scarcity sharpens competition, and competition makes the undead more useful as tools of terror or as instruments of extinction. The human tendency to exploit disaster for advantage worsens the problem, showing that the curse feeds on social breakdown as much as on meat. Yet compassion persists. There are stories of neighborhoods where watch rotations are strictly enforced, but where those on duty are known to share bread with poor families. In such places, the undead are staved off by a communal ingenuity that is less flashy than war but more sustainable, and these shared practices form the nucleus for what will survive the worst years. Community, then, becomes a method as much as a value. Artifacts emerge from this era that future generations will puzzle over: small clay figurines with stylized wounds and holes in their mouths, children's toys that are unfinished on one side, and girdle amulets etched with lists rather than images. These objects bear witness to the ways ordinary people try to make the world comprehensible enough to live in. They are humble testimonies to the human capacity for improvisation under siege. The medical practices, such as they are, adapt. Birth attendants and healers develop triage systems that are crude and compassionate, assessing likelihood of turning and prioritizing those who have the best chance of remaining living. The ethics of triage are debated and then institutionalized in ways that feel both modern and ancient. Beds are allocated, priorities set, and entire neighborhoods are designated as convalescent wards. Such systems save lives but also harden the emotional texture of the community. Trade routes, once reopened and then closed with the rhythm of terror, eventually discover new norms of exchange. Traders begin to use signal flags, exchange quarantine goods, and accept time delays as the price of commerce. This slow resumption of trade is not a return to normal but a transformation. Commerce learns to be wary and to value reliability over speed, to prefer secrecy when necessary and transparency when possible. Over many decades, a new vocabulary arises in the scribe schools, terms for stages of possession, words that denote degrees of memory retention in the undead, and classifications of behavior that may look eerily forensic to later ears. These words provide a scaffolding for understanding that will become a foundation for subsequent myth and law. They voice the practical insights that grew out of grief and survival and thus become a kind of living archive. There are also rituals of forgetting, small ceremonies meant to close the wound of memory so that society can continue. Families bury not only bodies but also certain stories. They choose silence as a form of mercy. This selective forgetting is sometimes coordinated by elders who decide that certain horrors must be damped for the children to continue living. In this way, loss and memory become policy. Generations later, the initial terror fades into a long shadow that shapes institutions rather than immediate fear. Schools teach the old precautions as part of baseline education, and songs carry the cadence of watchfulness. The undead become something like a mythic measure against complacency, an emblem used to justify many different policy positions and power plays. They are weaponized in rhetoric and codified in law. When foreign invaders come in subsequent years, they often find cities that are not what they expected, walled with greater intention, socially compact, and culturally vigilant. The experience of the plague has taught adaptation and resourcefulness, and in some cases the afflicted cities display an oddly increased capacity for coordination. Their communal structures can be harsh, but they are also survivable. Archaeological layers preserve the era in ways that later historians can read like rings in a tree. Pottery cracks at certain depths, and burnt beams speak of the scorched earth responses. Charred tablets record lists of names that are repeated across sites. Those who study these relics will one day piece together sequences that reveal patterns of loss and recovery, but much will remain hidden, folded inside the private practices of households that did not leave clay as a record. Centuries on, the buried fragment becomes the stuff of speculation. Some claim it was a meteorite infused with a form of life we cannot name. Others insist it was a curse laid by a jealous god. Myths emerge to explain it to children, who then pass cautionary tales into the soil of social memory. Whether astronomic, demonic, or symbolic, the fragment's legacy is to teach that the border between endings and continuations is fragile. The curse's presence in literature yields metaphors for swifter times. Rulers later used the undead as a symbolic shorthand for corruption. Poets write about hunger as political critique, and storytellers use the image to dramatize moral failures. Such appropriations sometimes dilute the original horror, but they also keep the memory alive in the cultural bloodstream. In that way, a plague becomes an idea that travels through epochs like a mariner carrying a story. Through it all, the people of Sumer do not simply endure, they create, adapt, mourn, and teach. They carve their experience into clay, into law, into lullabies and lores, into architecture, and into small clever things that make survival possible. The curse shapes them but never wholly defines them, because even in the darkest hours human ingenuity and kindness persist in quiet acts that never make it onto tablets meant for kings. The fragment's shadow does not fall evenly. Some regions are worse hit, while others maintain a precarious stability. Those local differences shape how customs evolve. A city that endured the worst years develops stricter ritual codes, while one that escaped substantial infection becomes more open to trade and risk. Such divergence later baffles historians who try to generalize the Sumerian experience into a single narrative. By the time the immediate crisis recedes into the rhythm of endemic risk, whole generations have been born and raised with the undead as a known variable. They do not live daily in panic but in a constant, low hum of preparation. Their language, architecture, and family practices are different in ways that feel as natural as the bends and the rivers themselves. Lineages of guardians who keep the knowledge of the fragment alive adopt a near-custodial role in society. They teach the young to weave names into cloth, to knot the shroud in particular patterns, to recognize the subtle signs of a turning mind. These practices are honored, paid forward, and at times ritualized into public ceremonies that bond neighborhoods into defensive communities. When outside civilizations eventually encounter the heritage of Sumer, they find an astounding continuity of custom. The later peoples adopt and adapt many of the preventive measures and mythic motifs, not always understanding their origin but appreciating their utility. The story of the plague ripples outward through trade and conquest, reshaping cultural exchanges in ways historians will later call subtle but significant. And yet it is impossible to tell the complete story of the curse without acknowledging the private tragedies that never find their way into official record. Whole families vanish from interior courtyards, leaving only a bowl or a threadbare of meaning. Small acts of compassion are swallowed by the noise of bigger events, unrecorded but no less real, forming the dark ballast of personal histories. Over time, scholarship attempts to reconcile the scientific and the mythical accounts. Philosophers in later ages will argue about whether the fragment created a biological agent akin to disease or whether it somehow altered the metaphysical rules that govern life and death. Neither camp lands on a definitive explanation, and the pluralism of theories becomes itself part of the legacy. Is the Marvel zombie outbreak science gone wrong or magic unbound? Subscribe and choose your camp in the battle over life and death. In unlikely corners, an art form blossoms from the fusion of survival technique and ceremonial expression. Puppetry evolves as a way to teach children how to avoid the undead. Masks are worn in festivals that double as drills. Dance becomes a coordinated set of motions that increase a community's readiness. That art is functional and sorrowful and brilliantly alive. When eventual travelers from distant eras pry open sealed vaults, they discover tablets that break the hearts of modern readers, lists of names with small notes beside them, turned, safe, given to river. Mundane scribbles that are utterly human. The intimacy of those annotations dissolves the distance between our age and theirs. Suddenly the people of Sumer are not mythic but immediate. The curse's narrative arc continues as a cycle rather than a line. There are flare-ups in later centuries, moments when previously sealed artifacts are loosed by curiosity or greed. Each resurgence is smaller, more localized, but it leaves the same mark of grief and renewed precaution. Communities adapt and then readapt, showing that survival is iterative, not absolute. In modern times, archaeologists and historians speculate about the fragment with the tools of later knowledge, isotopic analysis, geologic strata, radiocarbon dating. Their findings offer fragments of explanation but rarely the whole truth, because the true terror of the period was not only physical but relational. Science can date charred beams and clay, but it cannot fully reconstruct the terror of a lullaby interrupted by an imitation voice. Yet for all the scrutiny, some aspects remain stubbornly inscrutable. People of the present find themselves confronted with questions older than their telescopes. What happens when we lose the boundary between what feeds us and what keeps us human? How do communities adjudicate the worth of one life against the many? These are the ethical legacies of the curse as much as they are the evidentiary ones. The story is not over because stories are not concluded in the way battles are, rather they mutate into lessons and templates and rituals. The curse's footprint runs deep, and in each subsequent century its imprint appears in unexpected places: stonework, lullabies, the rules of markets. It becomes a kind of cultural memory that tests the limits of what societies can absorb and then make bearable. If one listens closely to the reed songs of Sumer now, beneath the modern city and beneath the layers of sand, one can still hear faint echoes of the warnings that once saved lives, the cadence of a watchman's whistle, the rhythm of a drum that calls for attention. These are not mere relics but living traces, whispered into earthen bowls and carried on the breath of bread-making. They are the city's way of saying that being awake matters. The curse, then, is both a wound and a teacher. It shows how quickly the familiar can become dangerous and how communities, through creativity and stubborn tenderness, can stave off the worst. The undead are not just a horror to be eliminated but a mirror that forces societies to reckon with how they care for one another when the rules of existence are altered. As centuries fold into each other, the memory of the plague of the undead in Sumer becomes a persistent motif in the moral imagination of many peoples. It is evoked by leaders and poets, by scribes and scornful rulers, always as a caution and sometimes as a ledger of past sins. The curse's lessons are repeated: watch, prepare, and do not forget the cost of complacency. And so the fragment story continues to be told and retold, not as a single bookend but as an ongoing series of negotiations between fear and hope. In every telling there is grief, ingenuity, and a stubborn insistence on care that defies the fragment's original impulse. This is not the end of a story but the persistence of a memory that refuses to lie down quietly. They called it a season of dust and hunger before they understood the meaning of the sound that rode the wind. At first the murmurs were only rumors shared under the thatch of reed huts, stories of strangers that came at twilight with hollow eyes and a smell like old ash. The rivers kept running and the barley grew, and yet the air carried an unfamiliar note, a dissonance the priests noticed between bowls and altars, between what the gods had promised and what the soil gave back. Enlil felt that dissonance first, or at least that is how the elders later told it, with the certainty of men trying to map a memory onto a god. He was the lord of breath and storm, the one who gave kings their power and took it away with a nod, and on a morning when the stars were still scattered like spilled beads, his council heard a whisper that did not belong to the city. It was not the whisper of a mortal fear, but of a ravenous hunger that echoed in the vaulted places where winds gather and gods confer. Nobody could say how the hunger was born, whether it was a trick of time or a fracture in the sky that led in another world, but the first victims trembled with a change that made household dogs flee. These strangers moved through markets as if memory had been pried loose from their bones, hands clumsy with old gestures repurposed to find flesh. They were not simply hungry like men who had missed their barley, they were hungry in a way the gods had seen only in the maw of myth, a wanting that consumed identity and sought to multiply itself. The people at the edge of Nippur named them the Hollow Ones and threw their names into the mouth of the river. The hollow was not just a lack of body but a hollowing of the soul, a theft of the spark that made a face. Mothers locked doors and fastened amulets and burned incense to smokes that made even the river smell sharp and new, but the hunger threaded through walls as if searching for a pulse it could understand and swallow. Enlil did not move like a man who takes a walk, his decisions ripped clouds and changed the color of the sky. When he spoke, the reeds along the canals leaned away, and the kings who bore his favor trembled for no light reason. He gathered a company of gods at the eaves of the world, drawing in deities whose names were carved on temple walls and those who had only lately found voice. For there was a pattern in the horror that needed unraveling, and no single god could bear the answer alone. The gods argued with the sonorous patience of a storm queue, each voice a climate of its own. Enki, who knew the craft of life and trickery of water, suspected an infection of exchange, a contamination that crossed the thresholds between things. Inanna, fierce and curious, wanted to walk into the streets in human guise and test a blade against the hunger herself, while Utu, whose solar judgment lit law and battle, poised to cast light where shadows gathered. Down among the reed beds, the first of the Marvel zombies, if the name had existed, appeared like a rumor given a body. They were wrong in proportion, limbs moving with a malnourished purpose but with a tenacity that mocked decay. They retained, in strange fragments, the gestures and oddities of far-off champions that would have meant something else in another time, a half-remembered web, a sparkle of metal machinery, a crown of shattered technology like broken stars. The sight of them set the flap of priests' robes aflutter and sent a tremor through households that had not known anything but cycles of flood and drought. People who watched them move could not easily lay out a cause and effect, they only knew the effect, which was immediate and corrosive. A trader who glanced at a zombie and later spoke in the market sounded as if someone had removed the tuning peg from his voice, and that slippage spread like fungus. Enlil first moved with thunder and cracked the clear day with a proclamation that was felt rather than heard. He ordered the gates of the city sealed by names and signs older than any king, and he tasked priests with priestly things and warriors with their sharp tools. Yet sealing is often a way of buying time rather than solving truth, and time is the thing the hunger seemed to unmake most adroitly. Marduk, whose star was rising in Babylon even as the older gods still held sway along the rivers, suggested a stratagem that turned some heads. He argued for the weaving of a net of story around the strangers, a series of enacted myths so convincing that identity, fragile as wet clay, might shift back into its proper mold. This was a test of narrative power as much as divine force, and the gods understood that stories tie mortal hearts and can distract or bind a contagion that feeds on form. So they told a new myth in the marketplaces and at the altars, a story retold until it became a muscle. Children were taught to hold a particular gesture and to sing a lullaby whose rhythm thrummed in the ears of the hollow ones. For a while, the tactic worked like a salve. Some of the infected froze with recognition, clutching the lullaby like a remembered shore, their movements stuttering between hunger and a ghost of who they had been. But the hunger was not fooled for long, and the hollow ones adapted, consuming the stories that were fed to them like paper turned into ash. They learned to mimic the gestures of the people who tried to bind them, and then they inverted those gestures into the motion of attack. The gods found that what they could teach could be corrupted and what they could command could be turned into bait. Nergal, older than the cities and lord of the underworld, watched this with a slow, private disquiet. He was used to death that claimed quietly, an inevitable end that carried names on its back, but he had not met hunger that reanimated like a damnable resurrection to feed. He wondered if the hollow ones were not merely dead men and women returned to consumption, but a kind of mirror plague, reflecting back the violence of more advanced ages into the earliest shapes of humanity. Enlil threw a storm that tore the reed roofs from the houses of the infected, and for a time the wind scattered them into the fields like brittle paper blown toward the horizon. The gods took advantage of the chaos to send emissaries among men, divinities who could walk in mortal skin and speak of bargains. The bargains were not simply offerings of grain, they were exchanges in which entire concepts were traded: memory for safety, names for shelter, songs for silence. These bargains had costs that a mortal mind could not easily inventory. A man who surrendered the memory of his brother for protection might find his days easier, but his nights restless with phantom voices that did not belong to him. A woman who traded the name of her child for a shield against the hollow ones watched with a cold steadiness as that child grew into a stranger. The gods found their own strategies undermined by the human price they required. The Marvel zombies resisted gods in ways gods had not prepared for, not with logic but with an instinctive hunger that turned every act of kindness into a scene of vulnerability. They were not mindless the way corpses are. They possessed a perverse intelligence that could learn fast, and then use what it had learned to breach sanctuaries. Their touch left a mark not merely on flesh, but on the faith of those touched, and the gods realized that even divine light could not be spread as a skin over every wound. Inanna stepped into this terrain like a goddess who preferred a blade to rhetoric and found herself both thrilled and terrified. She seduced one of the hollow ones with promises of worship and then stabbed it with a spear taught by Enlil's storms, but the creature laughed and bit at the air like a creature immune to praise or pain. The goddess felt the strange realization that ritual and force were both blunt tools against an enemy that rewrote the meaning of both. Utu, who rode across the sky with a lantern of justice, proposed a different tactic, to illuminate the very thing the hollow ones hid in the dark, laying bare the sickness with steady, burning light. The light revealed more than infection. It revealed the source of some mutations, objects that did not belong to the age, metallic glints and shards that hummed like fallen stars. These artifacts were not simply advanced. They seemed to carry an echo of another cosmology, a network of wool that had been folded through time into the river. Enki, always curious for the foldings of fate, took to the water and fished from the shallows those metallic hints. He found fragments of armor and a minute apparatus that pulsed faintly with a heartbeat not of earth. He hypothesized that the hollow ones were not a spontaneous curse, but a kind of infection carried by objects older than empires, things that traveled between worlds and left residues that changed the living into imitation life. That hypothesis sent tremors through the council, because if objects from other ages could seed hunger, then the gods were facing not just a plague but a tide of borrowed time. They had to ask whether these strangers were the last wave or merely the visible beginning of a flood of otherness. The thought that history could be contaminated by artifacts from future worlds made even the stoic deities shift in their sandals. The hollow ones continued to multiply in increments that made no arithmetic sense, as if consumption itself birthed replication instead of finishing it. Whole neighborhoods woke to find their mirror images returning the next day as creatures with faces like maps of loss. The gods could smite and unmate, but every unmade thing taught the hollow ones how to avoid the blow the next time. Cunning became the gods' most trusted currency. They traded it for allies in unexpected places. Merchants who had once worshipped only profit found themselves honored at altars because they possessed networks and pathways that outstripped what a god's gaze could reach. The gods learned to embrace human cunning, asking for roads and alliances rather than loyalty in a single currency that could be consumed. Around this bargaining, a new drama unfolded at the edge of the Euphrates where a camp of scholars, priests, and exiles gathered to treat the altered with experiments that balanced on a knife edge between compassion and cruelty. They kept meticulous lists and drew diagrams carved into clay, trying to pin the phenomenon with soft lines. They discovered that some who had been bitten did not turn within a single night but underwent a slow unraveling where personality liquefied into appetite. These observations were passed to Enlil with careful protocol and with the desperation of men who had found a problem that needed a god. The god listened and then suggested a rite of silence, an invocation to seal the names of those eaten into river clay so that they might not call the living into the hollow. The rite required a sacrifice that startled the priests, a concession of certain temple rights that would be lost, a memory traded for security. Some priests objected with a piety that doubled as stubbornness. Losing rights was like cutting a tree down to its roots. But Nergal reminded them that root and crown alike trembled when plague came, and Enki argued that survival would permit new rights to sprout. The debate ended in a compromise rolled out like dough, soft and necessary, and the rite of silence went forward under mud and reed, the names pressed until clay caught them and held them fast. For a time, sealing names bought a kind of peace, as if every word you keep is a lock you spare. But names are only part of an identity, and the hollow ones learned to circumvent the net by learning gestures and inflections that did not need names to reproduce the hunger. They evolved in details, as predators do, and the gods realized that arresting a contagion required more than sealing words into the river. While strategies shifted, so did the nature of the hollow ones themselves, and the gods observed a grotesque mimicry in their ranks. In some cases, the creatures appropriated armor and trappings of unknown manufacture, glinting with motifs that were not native to Mesopotamia, and they used these to stage a mock hierarchy that suggested an imitation of kingship. The sight of a group of hollow ones aping courtly mannerisms, mimicking the bearing of a king with shredded banners, was a lesson in the perversion of form. That mimicry cut deep into the social fabric because it made loyalty a dangerous thing. A man could no longer be sure whether the man beside him wore the skin of a friend or the costume of an eater. Families began to test one another with secret signs and remembrances that the gods had once taught as part of protection, and even these secrets grew leaky under pressure. The hollow ones were patient, and patience becomes a kind of terrible time that shapes a world. Enlil, feeling himself stretched between the needs of kings and the urgencies of survival, decided to enact a trial by storm that would be both divine adjudication and a form of cleansing. He called down a tempest to sweep across the banks and marshes, and in the wake of lightning carved a ridge of ash that reeked of divinity. The tempest drove hollow ones from their hides and opened raw wounds in the earth where artifacts had been buried, offering clues but also release for chaos. Into those open wounds stepped Marduk with his hand held like a plow, intending to turn the revealed artifacts into a weapon or at least a steady piece. He arranged a tribunal of smiths, scribes, and gods to attempt to break the devices cold as iron without letting their essence leak away. The devices were stubborn and shelled with material no smith knew, and every attempt to pry them open required compensations the gods had not foreseen. Inanna, restless and impatient, sought to find a weapon of direct application, something swift that would cut through mimicry and hunger alike. She journeyed to the underbelly of the city where a trader kept oddities from distant shores, and there she found a shard that crackled with a sound like a distant bell. When she clasped it, she did not feel power but memory, a cascade of images of other worlds where heroes had fought and fallen in endless cycles. The shard sang to her of far-off struggles, and with that song came an idea. What if the hollow ones were being fed not simply by hunger but by the stories that relics brought along? If artifacts carried echoes of other battles, then perhaps the echo could be severed from the object. Inanna could not wrench free the echo with a spear, but she could sing to it, contest it with a story that refused to feed the hunger. The tactic was perilous. It required the gods to offer up their own narratives as bait, and to risk a tale becoming a door. The gods agreed, and a chorus rose across the city, sung by priests and by a newly drafted company of men and women who could hold a tune and a story. They stood at dawn and the cries wove a lattice across the air, a tapestry of counter-narratives meant to starve the hollow ones of old songs they had consumed. For days the city hummed with voices, and the hollow ones wandered as if their map had been sketched over and erased. That hum reached even the temples beneath the ground where Nergal kept a watchful hunger of his own, and he yielded to it with a grave grace. He sent out emissaries into the fallen warrens to pull back the shadows with a measured light, because sometimes the line between letting go and holding tight is the difference between healing and more hunger. His emissaries found pockets where the hollow ones had accumulated into ghettos of appetite and, with the chorus as cover, they exhumed shards and returned them to the ritualists for examination. The ritual blacksmiths worked with trembling hands to contain the artifacts within vessels of clay and inscribed words, more traps than sanctums, because the gods learned that containment needed the language of both technique and supplication. They discovered that some artifacts responded to gestures as much as to force, and a particular cadence carved into clay could quiet the object's tremor like a lullaby. It was Enki who suggested the idea of lulling the artifacts into dormancy rather than shattering them, on the logic that shards broken by force bled their echo into the world. This approach changed the tenor of the fight from all-out war to a medical campaign, which suited the gods' varied temperaments. Doctors of the temples became primary actors, and healers who had once only mended cuts now monitored the tempo of breaths as if measuring the pulse of a siege. The divine presence in the leeching and the binding made the temples both bastions and laboratories, sanctuaries where science and worship braided into one. Still, for every artifact contained, more hollow ones took the field, and those who had once been champions in unknown worlds adapted to the old city's geometry with a disconcerting speed. A creature with a glinting mask learned to use a reed spear, and another wrapped pieces of metal and cloth to fashion a helmet. They were bricolage predators, using whatever the land offered to increase their lethality, and this made their movements at once archaic and uncanny. The gods realized that slaughter alone would not rid the world of the hollowing, it would only make graves where more hunger might root. Enlil conceived a harsher idea, one that would rewrite the covenant between man and God, to mark every human with a sign blessed by the wind, a sigil that would make the touch of a hollow one reveal itself. The marking was controversial because it meant changing bodies with divine ink, and body, to those who understood the gods, carries identity like a garment. Many humans balked at another brand upon their flesh, remembering past times when marks were tokens of bondage rather than protection. Yet the hollow ones had rendered trust precarious, and families traded liberty for the illusion of safety in cramped rooms. The gods promised that the mark would be a circle containing a breath and a reed, a symbol that would act as a kind of signal and not a yoke, but even a blessing smells of control when survival presses in. As signs were drawn upon foreheads and the inner wrist, a curious effect occurred. Some hollow ones recoiled not from the mark but from the idea it embodied. It was as if the sigil created a thin barrier of communal intent, a web of the living's collective refusal that the hollow ones could not quite pass. The strategy worked, patchwork and incomplete as it was, and for weeks the city experienced a false dawn where market bells rang and children ran without their parents clutching them too tight. False dawns teach more than true ones, for when the bubble bursts the clarity is shocking. The hollow ones returned with a tactic of mimicry so refined they could replicate the claimed sigils, even tracing with ash the same patterns and moving with the cadence of blessed breath. One by one communities recognized the limits of their wards, and panic returned to the edges of cultivated order. It was then that a small hero emerged not from a parade of priests but from the back of a craftswoman named Teramat who had always been good with threads. She used reeds and fine wire to weave a net that combined motion and language, a physical choreography that symbolized names and breaths together in a pattern that the hollow ones could not learn by mere copying. Her net was not a weapon but a mnemonic device, and when bound about doorways it made the air itself hum with a memory of the living. Every object in the city, even a child's toy, became potential armor or danger, and Tiamat's invention attracted attention because it negotiated the old boundaries between house and temple. The gods embraced her net because it allowed them to pour their power through human craft without needing to reshape the world entirely. The net turned the rhythm of daily life into a kind of defense and proved that ingenuity rooted in ordinary labor could be as crucial as thunder and spellcraft. Yet the Hollow Ones found a way to press against that too. They learned to use the very networks of care to move stealth and hunger across the city. They began to target the makers, to bite at those who stitched the nets, and to take comfort in sewing rooms where they could mimic the act of repairing. The gods watched this and felt the weight of ethical ambiguity. To safeguard, you must at times command sacrifice from those who already give much. In that moral fog, Enlil made a fatal decree, not for a lack of compassion but out of a space that logic carved for survival. He would take the breath of those who had been consumed and give it back in a different form. His plan was to cut short some lives to save many, to trade individuals already hollowed for the reinvigoration of a community's spirit. The decision polarized the pantheon because it asked gods and men alike to witness the price of a life that had been turned upside down. The ritual Enlil devised was complicated and intimate, requiring a weft of reeds and prayers, a vessel of clay, and a song that did not belong to any single god. It involved lifting the breath from a vessel of a hallowed one and molding it into a totem of living air that could be given to an infant or a dying elder. The transfer would not restore the stolen flesh, but it would fill a hole made by hunger and protect those chosen while also accepting the narrative cost of that choice. Humanity as much as divinity was asked to consent, and consent came in ragged pieces because grief is not a tidy currency. Families who had been hollowed were given dignities in exchange for allowing breath to be repurposed, a process that required the slow, human work of remembering and letting go. Some refused, holding on to the ghost of a name, while others stepped forward with iron clarity, offering what the Hollow Ones had taken to shield someone else from being taken. The ritual had unforeseen consequences, as all bargains do. The totems created from the breath contained a sliver of hunger itself, less a voracious beast and more a watchful emptiness that could keep other emptiness at bay for a time. Those who received the totems felt both blessed and strange, as if they now carried a vacancy inside them that would have to be tended like a lamp in a house during a storm. These totems were both solace and reminder that the gods' solutions were always partial, and the city adjusted its rhythms to maintain them. Ritual keepers became as important as farmers, and guardians of totems walked the banks at dusk with a weight in their chests. In the quiet between the waves of hunger, the people rediscovered small sanctities, shared bread, a child's laugh, the steady sound of oars in the river. Yet the metaphysical politics did not sleep because containing artifacts and sealing breaths is an ongoing commitment and not a final victory. The gods discovered that artifacts could be masked but not completely rendered inert, and that the Hollow Ones continued to mutate around the edges of containment. The creature's hunger learned to take subtle forms, corroding trust, eroding memory, making the faintest teeth of doubt nag at the fabric of daily life. As if to test the gods' patience further, new arrivals appeared near the marshes. Beasts and forms that seemed to be not human imitations but creatures from other mythologies tangentially known to Mesopotamian imagination. Some looked like winged dogs with metallic jaws, others like giant ichthyoid beings with a shimmer of man-made tesserae on their scales. They were not quite Hollow Ones in human shape, but they carried the same contagious shadow, as if the fracture between worlds allowed multiple strains to leak through. The gods convened a council unlike any before, where alliances had to be renegotiated and new roles accepted. Marduk took the lead in forging a compact between the young and the old gods, binding their different energies into a coalition that could move with both the fury of storm and the patience of water. This coalition began to map the patterns of contamination, tracking not only where artifacts had fallen but how they had been used, who handled them, and what stories were told around them. Out of these efforts a discipline emerged that was part clerical work, part craft, and part battle training, a hybrid the scribes named the Order of Keeping. They wrote codices on clay tablets to instruct future generations on the proper handling of objects and the language to be used around them, and these tablets were passed underground in amphoras to prevent theft of knowledge. The order trained watchers who could read small changes in breath and movement, an observational practice that melded ritual and empiricism. The order's method spread slowly, like a muscle learning a new rhythm, and its watchers became respected in towns where the Hollow Ones had once brought terror. They taught village elders to sing false lullabies that flattered human memory but did not feed the hunger, and they designed signs that resisted mimicry by integrating motion rather than static pattern. In these moments the world felt less like a battlefield and more like a repair shop, where every fix was provisional but necessary. Years, measured by harvest cycles and the rise and fall of rooks and game boards, passed, and with them a new normal settled, diffuse and pained. Humans learned to live with the occasional foray of a Hollow One at the edges of fields, a skirmish that left a scar and then perhaps a totem to heal the wound. The gods were no longer the only arbiters of fate. They had to share power with craft and with a resilient human ingenuity that had, in the pushing of the world, grown clever. Yet old habits are long and memory of easier times faded like pigment on pottery, so the Hollow One staged a coup of recognition. They discovered that memory itself was a resource, and they sought to lay in a winter of it. A slow work of cannibalizing stories until the city forgot its origins and therefore could not uphold the rituals that protected it. When ritual decays, walls grow thin, and gods know this truth as intimately as mortals. Enlil, who had been the busiest of the gods and the most weary, felt the city's forgetfulness like a personal wound. He sent forth a messenger not of thunder this time but of silence, a figure who walked into the marketplaces and stopped people mid-gesture, reminding them of a word or a smell, the exact pitch of a reed song, the detail of a child's laugh. The messenger's task was to stitch memory back into hands and mouths so that stories would not thin into paper and blow away. The approach worked unevenly because memory is stubborn and resistant and often flares when least expected. People who had been close to surrendering traditions found a reason to hold them, developing micro-rituals that could be taught in moments and repeated daily. The Hollow Ones, deprived of the large narratives they preferred, found themselves picking at the small rituals of cooking and bathing and finally at the private oaths families kept to one another. Under this pressure, Nurgle did what only a Lord of Death can do with grace. He made a bargain of seasons with the Hollow Ones, offering spaces that would never be re-entered by men in exchange for a cessation of attacks in populated areas. It was a dark truce, but it converted cities into safer places and left the marshlands and ruin zones to become uncanny reserves of hunger. The bargain meant that the gods endorsed a geography of fear in the margins, and that acceptance created a new boundary between cultivated life and abandoned domain. From the abandoned zones rose strange cultures of Hollow One colonies that developed grotesque hierarchies based on stolen paraphernalia and scavenged customs. They established their own ritual forms, perverse caricatures of human ways, and in that inverted liturgy they became more organized than before. These colonies proved both a threat and an opportunity. The gods could study them, and the Order of Keeping sent out watchers to unravel the patterns that made hunger take form. On these reconnaissance missions the watchers found a terrifying truth. The Hollow Ones were creating artifacts of their own, improvisations that blended stolen tech with fragments of Mesopotamian craft to make hybrid things that could still carry echoes into the living world. These objects were crude, but their very crudeness made them unpredictable because unpredictability could exploit any protective formalism. The Watchers realized that containment could not rely solely on the past because the future, or something like a future, was shaping new threats. In response to the improvisation, Marduk proposed renewing an old divine skill, adaptation through assimilation, not to incorporate the Hollow Ones but to convert their edges into instruments of protection. He suggested that the gods share aspects of their functions with chosen humans in a deliberate grafting of skill. Give a smith the patience of Enki, lend a scribe the sight of Utu. Each graft would need to be paid for in vows, as all things are, and the humans chosen would carry the cost of being part god in a world that mistrusted power. This policy created new classes of warriors and artisans who were neither fully mortal nor wholly divine, and they moved through the city with a palpable otherness that sometimes unnerved those they saved. But their presence hardened the defenses and created pockets where the Hollow Ones found fewer footholds. Their existence also complicated the relationship between people and the gods because to be chosen was both honor and an imposition. You received a divine capacity and surrendered a portion of your private fate. Stories of heroism grew around these hybrid figures and were sung in taverns and on riverboats, giving hearts a sense of narrative that the Hollow Ones could not easily replicate. The hollowing required a steady drumbeat of memory and ritual and craft, and storytellers became frontline workers. Their songs are kind of living barricade. Children learned to sing certain refrains the way river people learned to read currents, and the refrains kept minor attacks from reaching deep into community life. There were, however, moments of catastrophic failure that stripped the veneer of progress away, reminding gods and men of how fragile their achievements remained. A winter came when the river froze earlier than memory predicted and left boats trapped and grain stores isolated, and in that winter the Hollow Ones staged a concerted push. They exploited the urban exhaustion, and neighborhoods that had seemed secure were breached by a combination of cold, cunning, and hunger. The breach was a crucible that determined decades of policy. In neighborhoods where the order had embedded watchers and hybrids, the Hollow Ones were contained and pushed out with clever tactics. Elsewhere, where poverty had kept sentinel practices down, communities collapsed and the gods had to send lashing storms and waves of smoke to clear them, acts that left behind cratered spaces that smelled of scorched reed and blood. The gods learned in that winter that equity mattered. Security that favored the prosperous would not create a stable world. After that season, the gods and mortals restructured the distribution of protection, and a broader program of mutual defense and allocation of totems and nets was enacted. The Order of Keeping became more than a guild. It turned into an institution bearing the burden of collective memory, a civic duty baked into ceremonies of marriage and birth. The gods, grateful and weary, began to see mortal institutions not as mere instruments but as partners with their own reasons to persist. In time, the Hollow Ones' colonies developed their own tragic culture, a mirror world in which hunger sanctified certain acts and grief took on ritual forms. The gods peered into these colonies with a mix of horror and scholars' curiosity and discovered that some of the Hollow Ones had retained stubs of identity like knots of wool on a loom. There were former poets who still mouthed lines of verse between bites, and old warriors who staged mock battles as if to keep some semblance of honor alive. Enlil, watching these perversions of memory, felt a slow compassion that shifted his thunder toward reconciliation in small increments. He allowed emissaries to enter certain colonies with offers of exchange, leave behind certain artifacts, and in return receive a portion of sanctuary. The Hollow Ones, not a monolith but a dispersed people in various states of decay and cunning, responded unevenly, and the gods learned patience as a tactical resource. In some colonies, those offered sanctuary accepted and returned to human life, but they were changed profoundly, carrying the bruise of the Hollow Ones inside them. These returned individuals required long seasons to re-anchor their identities, and some never did, remaining in the shadow between appetite and personhood. Their recovery taught the gods and men that some wounds need tending across many years, and that there is no quick undoing of a world tilted by alien hunger. The long conflicts taught the scribes to write down not only victories but rituals and failings, and those clay tablets became the bedrock of an ethic that put care as central to survival. The order of keeping expanded its remit to teach the arts of resurrection, not literal reincarnation, which remained beyond mortal means, but the restoration of social networks, of jobs, of rituals. A woman who had lost a child to the Hollow Ones might be supported for a decade, given a place to reweave her life, and these social stitches prevented despair from becoming a new vector for hunger. The gods, in their pride and fallibility, still made mistakes. There were moments when arrogance led to interventions that worsened the infection. A god might try to harden a city's walls with a charm and accidentally impress the charm onto clay that housed an artifact, which then became a focal point of contagion. Each failure calcified into caution and humility, and over the centuries the deities moved from omnipotent saviors to careful partners who tempered power with listening. As the generations of humans adapted, a new ethos of co-governance rose that placed those who had survived hollowing in positions of authority over watch and memory. Survivors were granted the right to stand as arbiters in local councils because their experiences made them wary and wise. They developed a jurisprudence of taste and intuition, an oral law that complemented the scribes' clay tablets with living judgment. Temples evolved as well, becoming repositories not just of prayer but of community technique, a smith's forge beside an altar, a school for the order of keeping in the temple courtyard, a place where a child's first lesson included how to stitch a protective net as surely as how to pray. The gods understood this change as a step toward resilience because it embedded the sacred in the ordinary, making every act a possible line of defense. The Hollow Ones, constrained and clever, diversified their tactics yet again by focusing on the erosion of faith. They worked subtly to make people doubt the gods' attentions, to turn reverence into resentment, and suspicion into revolt. They spread rumors that the protections were a way of binding the poor and enriching the priests, and in times of stress those rumors found purchase among the vulnerable. That political battlefield was perhaps the most dangerous, because it targeted human structures of trust and made the gods' interventions appear self-interested. The gods, who had never before needed to defend their reputations in quite this way, found themselves learning the art of politics. Some responded by curbing their direct actions and allowing human governance more room to operate, others intervened more blatantly and risked alienation. In the channels of this political turbulence, a charismatic leader rose who called for reclaiming the margins as a space of living rather than a place of exile. Her name was Lugalitu, a woman of reedcraft who founded communities that practiced radical hospitality and refused the idea that the marshes must always be dark. She led groups into reclaimed lands where the Hollow Ones had once nested, offering work and ceremony and the slow labor of mending. Her approach was not universally embraced. Many feared that opening such spaces would merely invite catastrophe. But gradually her settlements proved that intentional living, combined with strict practices of memory and vigilance, could transform a scarred place into a garden of resilience. Lugalitu's communities became laboratories for hybrid techniques, nets spun with metal thread embedded into chants, centuries trained to read the rhythm of breath and song alike. The gods watched Lugalatu with a mixture of jealousy and admiration because she had discovered a way to turn marginality into strength without waiting for divine decree. She had, in essence, made the philosophical point the gods sought through top-down measures but had always missed, that the living must be the architects of their own protections. Enlil, humbled, began to send less thunder and more guidance, letting mortals fashion defenses that were not mere gifts but forms of self-determination. Centuries lengthened into a tapestry, and the hollow ones never disappeared completely, but they no longer marched through the cities with impunity. They became, more often than not, a hazard of the margins, a grim reminder that the world could be readjusted by borrowed objects and that vigilance required perpetual renewal. The gods settled into a new pattern of co-creation with humanity, one in which shrine and smithy, song and stitch, law and lore were equally honored. The cosmic implications of the phenomenon reached out like roots through time, however, and led some of the gods to suspect something darker about the source of the artifacts, that they were a symptom of a larger cosmic leakage between worlds. They saw, in the artifacts' glints, the signature of civilizations that had themselves been toppled by similar contagions, and that realization made them uneasy. If civilizations across other ages had been marred by the same hunger, then Mesopotamia was not alone in its labor to reweave life. Enki, always the tinkerer with curiosity tempered by dread, proposed an expedition into the deeper waters of cosmology to trace whether the artifacts had a home world and whether that world could be reached and negotiated with. Such travel would require a bridge of narrative more complex than any they had built, a story that could carry gods across the seam of time with enough force to negotiate a cessation rather than simply smite from afar. The idea enthralled some and terrified others, because it suggested the possibility of a multiverse problem that could not be solved by a single storm. A cadre of the pantheon, small and brave, prepared for this quest and took with them artifacts of their own that had been cleansed and quieted by centuries of ritual. They sailed in a vessel of speech and silence across a sky that seemed to thicken with possibility, and their voyage was a myth to later ages, a tale recited in the twilight by those who wanted to believe that there was an answer somewhere beyond mere local cunning. The expedition roamed through thresholds and came back with fragments of knowledge, worlds where hunger had been a song sung by machines, places where the boundary between artifact and organism had long been erased. Their report shook the world because it implied that the Hollow Ones were not an isolated error but part of an exchange between times where objects carry echoes like tides. The gods and humans together understood that containment would have to be complemented with a long-term program of cultural adaptation. They could not merely quarantine artifacts but rather redesign their relationship to material things altogether. It was an upheaval of civilization, like a recalibration of what to value and what to suspend. This realization shaped law and education. The Order of Keeping became a university as well as a guild, and children were taught at a young age to understand the contingency of objects, that every tool carries with it both memory and potential risk. Crafts were redesigned to avoid the metaphysical form factors that allowed echoes to hitch a ride, and rituals were adjusted to inoculate stories rather than mere names. The society transformed slowly into one that celebrated impermanence and skill over hoarding. Through all this, Enlil watched the slow arc of human resilience with a kind of patient pride that was quieter than thunder but perhaps more lasting. He and other gods became less the sole defenders and more guardians of a shared covenant that mixed divine power with human ingenuity. The city-states along the rivers settled into an uneasy maturity where the Hollow Ones existed as a known set of hazards, and the gods had learned to tailor their interventions to be less intrusive and more durable. Legends grew complex and patient, and a literature blossomed that told of the time of the Hollow Ones in many tones: lament, triumph, curiosity, and wary humor. The poets and the smiths sang of wartime nets and lullaby traps with equal affection, and the stories taught children not only fear but the methods of repair. The Hollow Ones, as a subject of narrative, became an engine of cultural practice rather than only an object of terror. Centuries further on, travelers from distant lands came to tell of similar things: ruins where the wind coughed artifact fragments into dunes and where statues wore the traces of imitation. These reports confirmed the gods' worst and sobering belief that the phenomenon had a broader geography, but they also offered the comfort of companionship. Other peoples had learned methods that could be shared. A slow network of knowledge arose, a coalition of reedcraft and ritual that spanned coasts and deserts, and it worked because it was built on conversation rather than conquest. Thus, the crisis that had once gripped a single city became a long-term transformation of how cultures related to objects, to power, and to one another. The gods, never wholly content nor entirely secure, settled into their roles with a wary affection for the human inventiveness that had saved their temples. Enlil's wrath had been a crucible, and out of it rose collaboration and a civic liturgy where god and mortal co-authored defenses against the leak of other worlds. Yet even with decades and lifetimes of adaptation, the world never quite returned to innocence. The Hollow Ones remained a presence, a fossil of otherness that taught every generation the cost of neglect. And in quiet evenings when the river shone like a blade and the reed beds whispered across the water, the old tale would be told again, the story of hunger that came from strangers and how breath and craft, song and stubbornness, formed a web around the living so that life might go on. The gods listened, sometimes silent, sometimes humming the lines along with the storytellers, knowing that their vigilance and the people's memory would be the living world's most vital armor. In the beginning, before steel and starlight, there was a city rising from the reeds and the river, carved in clay and voice, and that city was Uruk. It was called the first great city because its walls were the measure of ambition and because its temples kept the stories of mankind in their mouths. Yet even great cities have cracks where stories slip out, and in those cracks the impossible can take hold and spread like a rumor made flesh. When I say the impossible, I do not mean kings without crowns or irrigation without canals. I mean a hunger that was not hunger for bread but hunger for living warmth, a contagion that crossed from one mouth to another like fire. Imagine it first as a whisper among merchants in the market, a pallid face at dawn, a bag abandoned by a caravan, and then as a scream in the alley beside the ziggurat. The people of Uruk were practical. They blamed gods, miasma, curses, bad barley, but when a man who had been their neighbor rose and reached for another with teeth that crunched where flesh used to be, they understood an ancient terror anew. This is a tale where bronze met blood and myth took a body shape it had never worn before. We will meet figures who step from other ages and meanings and find themselves entangled with the first of cities, heroes with names that would later belong to comic books and to pulp, and monsters that recall the oldest epics. Their virtues and flaws remain human, wrapped in new skins. They still make the same choices under pressure. The story is as much about those choices as it is about the calamity itself. Uruk was a city of thresholds, thresholds of trade, of law, of worship. Its people were skilled at sealing thresholds with bricks and with oaths, but sealing cannot hold back everything. The infection in our story is not merely a disease, it behaves like an idea with teeth, as contagious as rumor and as deliberate as a tactic. The borders it crosses are not merely skin but memory and identity. In those crossings, the familiar becomes stranger, and strangers are made familiar by the need to survive. The earliest sign came at dawn, when the fishermen of the Euphrates found the nets fouled with something slick and wrong. They thought at first some unusual catch, something to be brought before the temple for inspection. Instead, they pulled up hands pale as fish bellies and a jaw that closed on nothing. Word traveled faster than any courier could ride. The city that taught Sumer to count barley now learned to count its friends as lost. From that first night, the city learned to categorize what it could not yet understand. Those who were sick were burned in thresholds, those who were bitten were confined and watched. Priests offered prayers, and physicians, using herbs and amulets and the crude wisdom of their craft, tried remedies by lamplight. All of these were human acts of defiance, and in human defiance there is often both nobility and disaster, for people in panic make choices that echo and widen. Some acts saved lives, others invited ruin, and almost every choice changed the city. Into this chaos strode individuals who did not belong to the city but to stories stretched across ages. They came as if the river itself had pulled them from some other time, heroes with strange accoutrements, with garments of unfamiliar cut and weapons that hummed with power. To the people of Uruk, these were like foreign gods arriving to be judged by the king, and in some ways that is what they were, measures of a world beyond the Tigris and Euphrates. They did not arrive in shining procession, they staggered in at the edges of streets, bewildered by the smell of smoke and the clamor of animals. Yet their names, spoken by the storytellers much later, would be those of legends and tragedies. These beings were drawn not by chance but by narrative gravity. Wherever a catastrophe peaks, myths tend to gather to see what will be written into the margins of history. The heroes who walked into Uruk were at once opportunists, lost travelers, and reluctant saviors. Some came seeking answers, some came bound by duty to stop something that haunted their own worlds, some came to test their strength against whatever force could unsettle the oldest city of brick. They found conditions that were raw and immediate, blood in the streets, markets abandoned, a watchtower made into a staging ground for survival. They met the people of Uruk in the only language both parties could still speak, action and necessity. One of these figures became known among the city's storytellers as the Bronze Sentinel, a towering silhouette with armor that reflected sun and moon in odd patterns. He moved like a machine and spoke with the cadence of command, though he admitted little about his origin. The Bronze Sentinel brought organization when disorder had spread like mud. He taught the city to fortify the gates more cleverly, to ration food, and to move the wounded behind walls where they could be tended without panic. His methods were efficient and cold, and efficiency in a time of plague is a strange salvation of its own. Others brought different gifts and burdens. A woman who had once been a comic conqueror by reputation arrived with eyes that had seen 1,000 catastrophes and hands that had healed or harmed in equal measure. She shared knowledge of containment that she had used in other plagues across other continents, wrap wounds tightly, burn fabric that tastes of the infected, isolate rather than embrace. But her arrival also meant that the city was now a crossroads for strange, alien ethics. She made decisions that the priests would not, and those decisions were not always flattering to the gods or to the old order. The city had to choose which authority it would obey, ancient ritual or the new techniques of strangers. As the days passed, the nature of the malady became clearer. It was not simply that infected bodies craved flesh, they also carried a kind of mnemonic hunger, as if they sought to consume not only life but the memory carried in the faces and names of the living. Survivors whispered that the infected would pause, as if remembering, before they struck. They targeted storytellers, elders, and priests with a different kind of focus, devoured the tellers, and the tales could be erased. This was a terror not only of flesh but of culture, for in Uruk, where stories were currency, to be robbed of memory was to be shorn of a soul. The priests took this as a sign that the gods had turned their face from the city, or that rival deities conspired in the dark. They called for rituals, for sacrifices, for the laying of curses upon the head of the river if it would not be compliant. Some rituals seemed to help in small ways. Smoke and psalm kept some areas free of the infected for a time, perhaps because the living were kept in motion and order. But ritual could not heal the deeper tooth marks, and the priests themselves found their ranks diminished by the very scourge they sought to appease. Gradually, the central narrative authority of the temple gave way to other kinds of leadership. Leadership splintered in predictable human ways. Communal councils formed in the shade of collapsed colonnades, sometimes led by women who had been merchants, sometimes by governors who had silver-hilted axes. The Bronze Sentinel formed a militia, and the Comic Conqueror organized supplies, but neither could fully contain the adaptive intelligence of the contagion. It mutated not strictly in a medical sense but in a social one. Patterns of movement, grief, and rumor helped it spread through human networks as effectively as any virus moves through cells. Every attempt to cordon off neighborhoods had to contend with human fear, which is both a spur to survival and an engine of chaos. Within the city, a small theater of internal politics became as crucial as the fight against the infected. There were those who believed the contagion to be a test from Ishtar herself, and others who whispered that it was an invasion by entities from beyond the firmament. Some opportunists took the absence of law to seize power, closing gates and hoarding grain while promising safety. The Bronze Sentinel would counter by requisitioning stores for the militia, stirring resentment and, at times, quiet compliance. With each action, the fabric of society was rewoven, sometimes in ways that strengthened Uruk, sometimes in ways that left it more brittle. At night, the city changed. The infected roamed like shadow-locked memories, their groans a chorus beneath the constellations that had always watched Uruk. The stars cast in different light, and under them the living learned to move like thieves, avoiding open spaces where the infected pooled in hunger. Fires burned in courtyards, and in those flames figures huddled and told stories to keep identity alive. Storytelling became not mere entertainment but a survival tactic, to speak names of ancestors, to recite genealogies, to rehearse laws, because every remembered name was a ward against erasure. It was in these nights that the Comic Conqueror and the Bronze Sentinel sometimes argued, for tactics that saved a family might doom a quarter of the city. He wanted rigid order and lines, she wanted flexible mobility and the preservation of lives at human cost. Their disagreements were not just about strategy, there were disputes over what kind of world Uruk would become after the siege. For those who endured the plague, the future would be shaped by whether the city would rigidify into a fortress or soften into a migratory community. Both options carried moral consequences. Amid this, an unlikely figure rose to significance, a scribe named Immerse, whose hands were stained with ink and whose memory was prodigious. He began to record not only laws and grain receipts but the names of those lost and the small acts of compassion that were otherwise consumed by chaos. Immerse's scrolls became a repository of human detail, a midwife saving a child, a baker looting for loaves, a child feeding an infected pigeon to spare a neighbor. His work was a kind of counter-contagion against forgetfulness. If the infected sought to devour memory, then Immerse would hoard it in clay and ink. This act of remembering acquired political potency. When the scribed scrolls were read aloud at dawn in the courtyard, they reminded the living that they had been more than beasts, that their losses were not merely numbers but stories. The bronze sentinel saw the value in this and used the names to rally the militia, while others feared that the scrolls would mark the recorded for infection if the contagion had some uncanny reach. The simple act of telling who we were became a form of resistance, and the infected, if their focus on storytellers was accurate, became more dangerous because memory itself was a field of battle. The contagion also changed the landscape of worship. Priests found altars desecrated and votive figures smashed or eaten. There was a peculiar horror when an idol of a small god was found defiled, for the people believed idols embodied the presence of divinity. At times it seemed that even the symbols of gods had not escaped the hunger. Some believed the gods were dead, others grasped more complex truths, that gods cannot be fed like mortals, that they are sustained by story and by those who tell it. In that sense, the city's shrinkage of memory was not merely sentimental loss, but a metaphysical risk to the pantheon that had supported Uruk's identity for generations. Outside the city walls, the river kept flowing, indifferent and merciless in its own clock. The farmers and fishermen who lived off its banks faced a different but related challenge. They were the first line of contact for the infected who came downriver, and the city had to balance its need to keep food coming with the risk of letting the afflicted cross its thresholds. A quarantine on the river would starve the city within days, and so bartering with vigilance became the only compromise. A fragile alliance formed between those who navigated the river and the militia who watched the gates, and in that alliance you could see how economy and survival braided into the same rope. Not all of the infected were the same. Some retained fragments of their former selves that would break like glass and cut the survivors anew. There were nights when a loved one would approach the gate and call its old name with a voice that was wrong, and every guard had to decide whether to open or to slam iron. Those choices were the tragedies written into the mortar of Uruk's walls. Sometimes the choice was merciful, sometimes not, and the memory of that decision could haunt a family for years. Into this quivering moral theater some of the stranger heroes brought artifacts that altered the calculus of survival. A small device that emitted a bright, sun-like pulse could repel the infected for a time, while another item, an ornate disc, could render a room colder, slowing the contagion spread. These were technologies and powers that the city's blacksmiths could not replicate, and their presence made the already complicated social calculus more precarious. People coveted such devices, others feared them as temptations toward tyranny. The line between protection and control narrowed with every passing week. There were moments of lyric beauty amid the horror. The comic conqueror taught children how to make paper birds that could be carried across the river as tokens of hope, and on one morning thousands of paper birds rose like a flock from rooftops and flew over the Euphrates. For a brief time that day, the city felt as though it had not been partitioned into living and not living. That collective breath was not wasted. It reminded the survivors of their capacity to imagine and create despite everything. Such gestures mattered as much as any tactic because they preserved what the contagion sought to erase, the human capacity to name and to make meaning. At the same time, there were tactical failures that cost many lives. A botched attempt to clear a warehouse where the infected had nested resulted in the spread of contagion deeper into the worker neighborhoods. The Bronze Sentinel's militia suffered losses, and with them the illusion that force alone could solve the problem. The comic conqueror responded by advocating for more humane quarantines, but humane measures often require trust, and trust was in short supply. People hoarded and lied and sometimes opened gates to reunite with loved ones, and each deception could become a new outbreak. A turning point occurred when the infected began showing patterns of coordination that suggested more than random hunger. They began to herd, to flank living groups, and occasionally to sacrifice one of their own in order to break a defense. Survivors speculated that the contagion had gained an intelligence that was not merely parasitic but strategizing, using the social arrangements of the living as an extension of its will. This terrified the city's commanders because a force that could exploit human behavior was a force that could be outmaneuvering them without any physical superiority. They realized they were not simply eliminating a disease, but facing an antagonist that adapted to tactics as if it learned from each engagement. It was here that the mythic quality of the story returned with force. The people began to tell of a central throe of hunger, a monstrous figure that would supposedly coordinate the infected from within an abandoned palace or beneath the ziggurat. They called it by many names: the Hollow King, the Maw Beneath, the Dead Oracle. Whether any such single intelligence existed was uncertain, but belief has power. If enough people believe in a monster, they will act as if it is there, and those actions can either create or derail the very strategies necessary to survive. In times of extreme peril, alliances form across the most unlikely divides. The city's scholars, once relegated to copying legal tablets, became tactical analysts, noting movement patterns and compiling maps of infection. Fishermen offered river routes that avoided herds of the infected. Children, small and agile, were trained to slip between ruins to fetch food, becoming a brave and terrible cadre of supply runners. Even petty thieves found a place in the reconfigured economy. They stole infected corpses that still had coin and hid the loot for families in need. In these improvisations you could see the city's essence, a capacity to repurpose anything for survival. Not all improvisations succeeded. A ritual led by desperate priests, invoking an ancient curse against an imagined rival god, ended up driving a herding of the infected toward a poor quarter already weakened by hunger. That mistake cost many lives and ignited a bitter backlash against the temple. The city's politics hardened into factions: those who supported the priests, those who backed the practical military approach, and those who wanted to flee and restart elsewhere. Each faction's vision of Uruk's future implied different values and different moral reckonings. Fleeing was not so simple. The surrounding lands were no sanctuary. The infected had already spread along caravan routes and into smallholdings, and rumors of whole villages taken persisted as cautionary tales. The Bronze Sentinel argued that staying and fortifying was the only option to preserve any continuity of civilization, while others argued that a mobile people could outpace the contagion and start anew. Both arguments were persuasive. The decision to remain would bind the survivors to the city's memory and its past losses. The decision to leave would risk erasing the very history they wanted to save. Some small groups chose exile. They picked at dawn, carrying clay tablets, scorched idols, and whatever seeds they could spare, and they left under cover of smoke to avoid the infected roadblocks. The journey became its own story of grief and resilience, for the people who left encountered other horrors and other small mercies in equal measure. They taught one another how to cultivate abandoned terraces and how to keep watch for faint signs of infection. Over time, these migratory communities began to gather their own myths about Uruk, some of reverence, some of bitter regret. Back in the city, the remaining inhabitants doubled down on preservation. Inmen scrolls multiplied, and a small school of scribes formed to copy and keep as many texts as possible. The Comic Conqueror championed the idea that memory must be physical as well as oral, so she helped establish a subterranean repository where the scrolls could be kept safe from fire and scavengers. In that hidden chamber, the recorded names of victims and saints lay next to handbooks on herbal remedies and crude maps of the plague's progression. This repository was both pragmatic and sacramental. It represented what the living believed needed saving if they were ever to rebuild. Amid these acts of preservation, a different kind of experiment took place. Sometimes, in desperation, survivors tried to reason with the infected, to find in their bodies a thread of the person they had been. These attempts were heartbreaking and usually failed, but once in a while an infected would hesitate when faced with a particular melody or a family artifact, as if the shard of memory could still tug. Those moments were both balm and torment. They confirmed that identity was not entirely erased and yet also underscored how perilous any contact could be. The survivors learned to cherish those fragments at a distance, using recorded songs and images as safe conduits for memory that could not be risked in person. As months passed, the calendar of Europe being kept in a muddle of hope and ritual, the city began to adapt. The infected had not been completely eradicated, but their numbers stabilized when the living learned better ways to isolate and deny them resources. The Bronze Sentinel's fortifications evolved into a labyrinth of controlled exposure points designed to corral herds away from essential supplies. The Comet Conqueror's lessons about mobility prevented entire neighborhoods from being boxed in. The city became a poem of resilience written in mud and resolve, and its people learned a new kind of economy, trading stories for help and salt for healing herbs. This uneasy equilibrium allowed the survivors to begin more ambitious mental labor. They started to theorize what had caused the contagion beyond the immediate. Some speculated it was a curse of the gods, others thought it came from the distillation of too many borrowed beliefs. The Comet Conqueror suggested an external origin, a vector carried across seas by travelers in trade, an alien germ that had slipped into human communities. These theories mattered because how one explains a catastrophe shapes the remedy one seeks. If it was a curse, one would seek the god's appeasement. If it was a foreign agent, one would hunt its source. Reason and myth thus bent together to form policy. The hunt for a source led to surprising discoveries. There were artifacts along trade routes that bore a strange residue, an encrusted darkness that resisted flame and fire. The scholars, those who had once worshipped the mathematical order of seasons and barley, examined samples and found patterns that led them to hypothesize a slowly mutating organic compound. They could not say whether this compound had a mind of its own, but they saw it responding to stimuli and consolidating when given organic hosts. The problem was that the city lacked the laboratory to test such theories methodically, and most attempts to burn or dissolve the residue created more dangerous spatters that infected new areas. In one notable episode, the Allies mounted a dangerous expedition beyond the walls to a ruined temple complex where the residue seemed concentrated. They traveled under darkness, hoping to avoid herds, and found a chamber where the walls themselves had been chewed and mottled by the same dark substance. At the center was a sunken basin in which the mold-like mass quivered like a sleeping thing. The heroes debated what to do. The Bronze Sentinel wanted to annihilate it with fire, the Comet Conqueror suggested a careful removal, and the scholars argued for containment and study. They compromised on a plan of cautious incineration, and the blaze that followed spread embers on the wind that caused many of the surrounding reed huts to catch. In trying to destroy the source, they had created new vectors, teaching the city again how fragile any victory could be. The tragedy of that night hardened certain factions and softened others. The Bronze Sentinel's enemies argued that his rigid approach had led to unnecessary deaths, while his supporters claimed that decisive action was always required in war. The Comet Conqueror found herself wanting an enforcement power. she could propose humane solutions but could not command obedience the way a sentinel could. This tension crystallized into a cultural debate. What was the right balance between law and mercy in disaster? The question was ancient, and Uruk's ordeal only made it more pressing. During the second year of siege, a remarkable development occurred. One of the infected, worn and ragged, stumbled into an empty courtyard and, by some act of private madness or genius, did not attack the living. It shuffled to the center and began to repeat in a cracked, obscene voice the name of a child it had once known. In that broken recitation, the city's linguists recognized a strange pattern of chanting, an echo of a language older than Uruk's current dialects. The elders and scholars listened and realized that beneath the contagion something else had been grafted, an ancient chant used to bind spirits in earlier epics. If the infected carried not only hunger but also linguistic cargo, then perhaps language itself could be a tool. This revelation sparked daring plans. The comic conqueror proposed using recorded songs and ritual speech to distract and guide the infected, steering them away from living quarters. The bronze sentinel agreed to a limited experiment, a controlled path lined with drums and recorded chants leading to a barren plain where the infected could roam without encountering food or fire. The experiment had partial success. Large groups did indeed follow the sound for a time, but once boredom and atavistic hunger took over, they scattered again. Nevertheless, the idea that the infected might respond to certain patterns of sound offered a sliver of leverage. That sliver of leverage led to a more audacious gambit. The comic conqueror and a group of linguists decided to compose a song designed to trigger the chant-like memory embedded in the infected, aiming not to soothe them but to shepherd them into containment. Enmin, the scribe, contributed lines from the scrolls, names, genealogies, prayers that had resonance. The psalm was an odd concoction, part lullaby, part litany of remembered names, part technical instruction for movement. It was sung in courtyards at dawn and at dusk to slowly accustom both the living and the infected to its rhythm. The result was more complex than they had hoped. For a time, groups of infected were guided out of the city, following the cadence and the names. For the living, the song was at once a comfort and an instrument of pain, as it forced listeners to speak aloud the names of the dead in order to direct the infected. This meant memory was weaponized. Some survivors refused to sing, arguing that to use names as bait was to desecrate the dead, while others argued that any means to survivability was permissible. Culture and utility were now tangled in a way that made moral clarity impossible. As seasons rolled, new generations grew up with this music embedded in their wakes. Children who had known no peace would march to the rhythm of the containment songs and be reared in neighborhoods redesigned to withstand both hunger and invasion. New trades emerged, calligraphers trained to write names in protective patterns, artisans forging grates that could close with minimal human interaction, and gardeners who learned to cultivate crops that were less likely to attract the infected. The city's economy shifted from international trade to an internal resilience, and that, in turn, rewired how people thought about what it meant to be Urukian. Yet no adaptation was airtight. A pestilential cunning remained in the contagion's capacity to exploit the living's emotions. It could mimic a friend's voice, and the call of a named child could lure a parent out into a trap. In those moments, the city learned how easily morality could turn to weaponry. A desperate group might feign a call for help to distract guards and steal grain, or a leader might sacrifice a quarter for the promise of restoring the temple. The ethical calculus grew complicated, and the blame fell uneasily on many shoulders. Into this fog of ambiguity arrived an emissary from a distant mountain culture, a figure who had fought in epidemic wars and who recognized patterns that Uruk's people had not yet seen. He observed that the contagion's most dangerous feature was not merely its appetite but its ability to reshape social bonds, turning kinship into traps. He proposed a radical social restructuring: rotate watch duties so no family would be isolated, codify mutual aid into enforceable law, and replace public hoarding with communal equalizing. His proposals were political dynamite but practical, because they targeted the contagion's social vectors rather than its biological ones. Acceptance of these ideas meant ceding some personal freedom in favor of collective security, and that bargain defined Uruk's next phase. This phase was marked by a new kind of ritual, a covenant tablet that recorded obligations among neighbors. It was read aloud at the gates and in the temple, and those who refused to abide were ostracized. The covenant worked in the sense that it improved distribution and reduced opportunistic hoarding, but it also hardened social surveillance. The city became efficient but watched, and the Bronze Sentinel, who had always favored order, found a new legitimacy in enforcing the covenant. The Comic Conqueror, who feared the consolidation of authority, continued to push for decentralized solutions, and the tension between them never quite dissolved. Years blended into a decade, and the city that survived was not the same as the one that rose from reeds. It had been reformed through catastrophe. Its walls were thicker in places and thinner in others, sealed for secrecy where art and story had once been open. The infected no longer roamed freely within the heart of the city, but they persisted in broken ruins and in camps beyond the river. Life in Uruk became a careful architecture of routine and vigilance, and its people developed a language that could describe both hunger and hope. The cultural memory of the siege became the core of Uruk's identity. Annual rites commemorated the day the first nets were fouled, and the city teachers made sure that children learned the songs that once guided the infected from harm. These songs were taught as part of survival and as part of a civics education: sing the names, respect the covenant, watch the gates. Storytelling returned in force, but it returned rewritten. The scribes prioritized survival lore alongside myths of heroism, because for a community that had endured erasure, practical memory was as sacred as epic. Yet the story of Uruk also traveled outward as travelers carried news of the siege along trade deserts and river routes. Other cities changed their behaviors upon hearing these tales, instituting quarantines and covenants of their own. The Bronze Sentinel's tactics and the Comic Conqueror's flexible strategies were debated in councils beyond Mesopotamia, and the scholars' ideas about sound and memory were transformed into songs and talismans elsewhere. Uruk's suffering thus seeded a broader human repertoire for coping with contagion, and in that transmission lay a bittersweet kind of immortality. Not all stories that left Uruk were flattering. Some told of leaders who had become tyrants, of covenants that had been used to punish enemies, and of songs that had been turned into weapons. These versions were reminders that suffering has many narrators and that history is always composed of competing vantage points. For the survivors of the siege, the truth was complex. They had preserved much, but at costs they still debated by the lamplight. In that debate we find the heartbeat of the city, a living conversation about what it means to be human after a near erasure. As centuries layered, the contour of the siege became mythic. Later storytellers grafted other motifs onto the tale: the involvement of gods paying their price, heroes whose names matched figures in strange future narratives, monsters that were neither dead nor fully living. The mythic version lost some factual detail but gained symbolic resonance. It became a canonical parable about memory and survival, about the vulnerability of stories to being devoured, and about the stubbornness of human communities to knit themselves back together. Modern listeners of this old tale might find echoes in contemporary plagues and in the ethical puzzles posed by crisis management. There is a persistent lesson in the way Uruk transformed. Catastrophes cannot be made purely technical problems to be solved by force. They implicate social bonds, memory, law, and imagination. The Bronze Sentinel provided necessary discipline, the Comet Conqueror offered necessary flexibility, the scribes provided necessary remembrance. None of these was sufficient on its own, and their interdependence was the real story. Finally, the siege of Uruk enriched the city's literature. Poets wrote elegies that folded the names of the dead into metaphors for the river's flow, and playwrights staged dramas that reenacted the moral choices of wartime. The arts thrived paradoxically because the city's reinvestment in memory created an appetite for expression. Immerse scrolls were copied into more durable forms and placed in temples as both historical record and ritual object. In a culture whose gods required stories to exist, the act of recording saved God and human alike. Over time, the infected became a peripheral horror in certain pockets and a living cautionary tale in others, but they never fully disappeared from the region's consciousness. The lessons of Uruk informed new laws of hospitality and quarantine, and traveling bards sang songs that combined both the containment rhythm and the names of heroes who had saved or imperiled the city. Those songs traveled like seeds, planting memory and caution in foreign soils. Uruk, which had once been threatened with erasure, became a source of pedagogy for survival in an uncertain world. In the long arc of human time, what matters is not only the catastrophe but the responses it elicits. Uruk's responses were mixed, creative, and frequently contradictory. The Bronze Sentinel's fortifications endure as monuments to decisive defense, while the Comet Conqueror's improvised humane measures live on as testament to flexibility. Immerse scrolls remain as proof that naming shields us from dissolution, if only for a while. When these threads come together, they form a tapestry that both narrates and protects civilization. This tale can be read as a warning and as encouragement. It warns that any society which values memory must actively protect it from forces that would devour names and narratives. It encourages by showing that even in the darkest sieges, human beings find ways to adapt, to record, and to sing. The siege of Uruk teaches us that survival is not only the preservation of bodies but the preservation of stories that make bodies into persons. The hungry world will always test us, but the act of telling remains a stubborn, human resistance. If you close your eyes and imagine the city now, picture a place withered but animated, its ziggurats still standing though scarred, its walls bearing the echoes of many arguments. See groups of children learning the containment songs, elders telling stories of lost names, and artisans repairing idols with offerings of small, precise craftsmanship. The infected are remembered as an enemy that reshaped civilization, not as a final victory over humanity, but as an agent of transformation that forced new kinds of empathy and governance into being. Uruk survived because its people adapted not just their weapons but their stories. In that imagination, consider the paradox that the very act of trying to prevent erasure sometimes requires acts that feel like erasure, refusing to open a gate to an imploring voice, or omitting a name to use it as bait. The moral ambiguity persists, and each generation has to decide how to weigh the cost of mercy against the cost of survival. Uruk's example offers no neat answer, only the reminder that such choices will always be with us and that their consequences are heavy. It asks us to hold the weight of those decisions with humility. And so the siege of Uruk remains a story told at firesides and in courts, a long narrative braided into the culture's memory like the reeds that once lined the riverbanks. It is a tale of heroes who arrived from other times and of ordinary people who discovered reserves of courage and cruelty alike. It is a story about the indispensability of names and the fragile scaffolding of social trust. If there is any final lesson, it is this: when a city is besieged by forces that would unmake memory and personhood, the human response must be to record, to sing, to bind one another with oaths, and to remember the dead so that the living may continue to be human. Long after the city rebuilt, clay tablets documenting the strike would survive the ravages of time, buried beneath layers of subsequent lives and rediscovered in later ages by scholars with more patience than greed. These fragments offered not total clarity but a mosaic of human responses: fear, calculation, compassion, cruelty, each piece inviting readers to imagine what it felt like to stand at a threshold and choose. The rediscovery of those documents would inspire new narratives, new questions, and an enduring fascination with the time when the living found themselves assailed by the likeness of death. Night fell over the alluvium like a heavy lid, and even the moon seemed to pause above the flatlands as if listening. In the hush that followed the day's labor, clay tablets cooled in the hands of scribes who had no name for what was coming. They recorded kings and grain, treaties and stars, assuming the world's arc would bend as it always had. That assumption was about to be broken in a way that would make kings remember hunger as a law of gods and men alike. The first sign was not thunder nor fire, but a rumor that passed between traders, a whisper at a market stall that one who had been seen near the river had gone to bed a man and risen unable to sleep. He spoke in a voice that was not his, and he looked at his hands as if expecting them to feed him. Merchants closed their stalls. Fishermen thought of nets and the dark water. No ritual could be reached in time to hold the world together against a new appetite. It grew like a fever in a household and then in a city, not a fever of heat but a fever of desire that made men and women throw themselves into the night, into the bazaars, into the temples, seeking anything to fill an absence they could not name. Those who were great and those who were small found themselves equalized in that hunger. Palaces and hovels smelled the same in the morning, and a silence that was not sleep spread through the streets. The ancient gods, who had presided over storms and harvest, watched from the high places and saw their supplicants turn monstrous. But this was not simply a plague of common bodies. It took to the strong as readily as to the weak, and where it found force it magnified it. Warriors returned from border skirmishes with an unending craving that no ration or oath could satisfy. Captains of chariots who had once been feared for their command became the first of an army that feasted not upon grain but upon flesh and power. In the hours between sunset and dawn, banners were lowered and then ripped upward as if by some hungry wind. The Assyrian courts, which had been meticulous about omens and the placement of offerings, struggled to interpret the signs. Priests read entrails, sifted the ash of past fires, and consulted stars. Some scribes thought it a malediction sent by a god affronted. Others whispered of new gods, older than the pantheon and hungrier. In the great libraries, tablets were unrolled and copied under lamplight, because knowledge was the only weapon the learned could mount against a force that aided impulse itself. In the libraries of Ashur, the king's scholars debated the provenance of the sickness, arguing that it was not born of the earth but arrived from beyond reed and river. They traced threads of rumor all the way to distant coasts where traders spoke of shimmering lights over the sea and men who had fallen into an unholy euphoria. A handful of texts, older than memory and written in a cramped cuneiform that smelled of dust and myrrh, suggested that hunger could be a contagion born from contact with something unformed. Those texts were sealed in a chest until the urgency of the moment forced them open. Those who had read the sealed texts grew quiet and stern. They spoke of a hunger that did not simply want to fill stomachs but to consume identities, the grafting of desire onto the will. It was not enough to eat, the hunger strove to remake. It did not leave familiar faces unchanged. Instead, it carved them into parodies of themselves, leaving behind echoes and empty rituals in the mouths of priests, in the hands of kings, and on the banners of generals. For the first time in living memory, the instruments of order could not be trusted to hold it at bay. As the days folded into one another, the infected found ways to use their remaining reason. They learned that fear itself could be sharpened into an instrument. Some who remained partially coherent used their authority to open gates and call the restless to the streets, and their commands became the first orders of an undead bureaucracy. This made the plague more dangerous than a mere mob. It made it an empire that could plan, that could raise siege engines and point them at walls that had stood for 100 reigns. Cities went from humming centers of trade to theaters of nightmarish feasting. The market of Nineveh, once braiding spices and cloth into a tapestry of wealth, was reduced to a place where the living ran like fish in a net. The city gates, watched by watchmen who had died but still stood, closed only to be broken by those who had loved them. In that collapse, alliances formed and disintegrated in the space of a breath, and what was once a proud procession of statecraft became a scramble for anything that would blunt the hunger for a single hour. News of this unnatural devouring traveled with slaves and caravans, and it was here, in the cruel calculus of empire, that the contagion found a new host, ambition. Rival states sent envoys to probe the disaster, not to help but to see if the moment could be used. Armies advanced under the banner of retribution and plunder, carrying rumors and, unwittingly, the contagion within the folds of their cloaks. Thus the hunger spread not by happenstance alone but by strategies of men who thought they could wield the monster as a weapon. One general, arrogant in his tactical calculations, ordered a night march across marshes to take a weakened city. He did not account for the persistence of the hunger in those it had touched. His columns moved through fog and reed, and by the time they reached the city walls, the first chieftains among them had been converted. Those chieftains opened the gates for their brethren, and the city surrendered not to siege engines but to hands that knew the lock of its gates and the sleeping place of its watchmen. With conquest came a curious metamorphosis. Where other plagues leveled populations and left ruins, this hunger built something new and terrible out of human industry. Siege towers were repurposed to carry the living as bait. Siege ramps were turned into altars. Those who thought themselves immune because of their distance from the afflicted were taught an inversion of complacency as the hunger learned strategy from those it consumed. It honed the instincts of commanders and kept the discipline of soldiers while removing the compassion that held armies to codes of war. Holy men tried to counter it with rites, and for a time their ceremonies had effect. They burned cedar and juniper, intoned prayers to Ashur, and sprinkled water that glittered in the torchlight. Some confused relief flickered, like a candle struggling against wind. But rituals require belief, and belief is a fragile thing. As famine and violence made belief harder to cultivate, the supplicant's words began to sound hollow. The gods, whose shrines were trod into by hungry feet, were asked to judge a world they might no longer shape. It was in this hollow that heresies grew. A new cult rose amid the rubble, venerating the hunger as inevitable and cleansing. They argued that resistance was vanity and that embracing the appetite made one a part of something larger. In temples where bronze figures of gods once presided, banners were refashioned with symbols of empty mouths and crossed bones. Villagers who had been kept alive by the charity of the state now knelt not to gods, but to hunger itself, and the line between human and monster blurred with terrifying speed. News of such cults reached the palaces of kings and the tents of generals, and it shifted the tactics of resistance. Where once rulers sought to crush heresy with edicts, they increasingly found themselves bargaining with it for time. Deals were made in dark corridors, food in exchange for safe passage, territory in exchange for labor. The bargains were temporary medicine against an illness that wanted not to be cured but to expand, and every compact made the hunger more political, more like a state with ministers and laws of its own. Into this world strode figures that had been legends in other ages and places, men and women whose deeds were sung in distant courts and whose faces had been rendered on coin and clay. Heroes did not rise in the way they had in tales. They were called upon as tools by worried rulers, and their attempts to hold the line were tests in futility. Some fell quickly, taken by the quicksilver of appetite. Others lingered and became cautionary tales as their names were adopted by the hunger and turned into something obscene. The mythopoetic space shifted, and storytellers began to whisper of dead champions who wore teeth like crowns. Among these transformations, the strangest was how the hunger interacted with the divine. A god who could not be fed by worship turned, in a certain sense, into a beggar among mortals. Where prayers once created rain and protected flocks, now offerings were laid at the feet of men who had learned to mimic sacrament. The gods, though ancient and vast, were forced into new roles as observers and, occasionally, as bargaining partners. They sent omens and dreams, and sometimes they spoke through the mouths of the dying to urge acts that would not necessarily be heeded. Beyond the topography of flesh and stone, some scholars in the libraries entertained a hypothesis that was at once terrifying and methodical. They posited that the hunger had a pattern, almost a grammar, that could be studied like any other phenomenon. They began to chart its spread, marking dates and places and the sorts of people first infected in each location. This academic discipline was macabre, but it offered the Zionist hope. Knowledge could reveal weakness. They saw that the hunger moved faster through centers of trade and slower through isolated hamlets. They inferred that connectivity was its ally, and isolation its weakness. That realization led to grim policies. Some city-states sealed themselves with brazenness bordering on barbarity, cutting off trade and burning bridges to keep out the contagion. Other polities decided that quarantine was cowardice and solved to crush infected neighbors before the hunger could learn to outthink them. Both approaches had victories and failures, and neither could claim a clean moral high ground. As boundaries hardened, the map of Mesopotamia became a mosaic of terror-managed enclaves and devastated wastelands. In the marshlands where reeds grew tall and the channels curled like sleeping snakes, resistance took on a different flavor. Peasant guerrillas used the labyrinth of water and mud to outmaneuver the hunger's disciplined forces. They learned to bait it into bogs and let the marsh swallow engines and men alike. The hunger did not like mud. It required bodies and firm ground to build the stages of its appetite. These marsh dwellers, once despised as backward, suddenly held a strategic advantage and a form of pride that seemed almost sacred. Yet where geography bought time, it also hardened the desperate into tyrants. Leaders of small bands, having tasted power, grew possessive. They hoarded food and even people, exchanging them only for loyalty. In such camps, the line between saving lives and enslaving them blurred. The hunger did not need to control every mind when it could create a culture that celebrated possessiveness and the instrumentalization of human lives. Across the length of the land, fortresses became centers of learning not merely for swordplay but for immunology of a sort. Physicians and exorcists shared courtyards and arguments. They dissected tissue and read incantations until the walls echoed with both science and superstition. An uneasy truce formed between rational men and those who spoke of gods, because the crisis was too large for a single methodology. If a man could be cured by an herb, let an herb be tried. If he needed a rite, let a rite be recited. Their combined efforts produced results that were partial and often temporary, but they were, for a while, a form of hope. The grim arithmetic of supply lines became central to campaigns. Armies that moved had to be fed, and food convoys became the Achilles tendon of any campaign against the hunger. Raiders learned to strike the convoys, not the fortresses, and the hunger adapted by developing modes of interdiction that included deception and subterfuge. Those who carried the sacks of grain sometimes were infected and used as Trojan horses. The hunger became adept at camouflage, at using the trappings of civilization to infiltrate it. In one notable incident, a library caravan carrying tablets thought essential to the study of the contagion was infiltrated. The courier, infected but cunning, delivered the scrolls to a fortress and then loosed a scream that was part howl and part litany. In the confusion, soldiers dragged the scrolls inside and then opened them to read, while the hunger spread from hand to hand. Later, scholars would wring their hands over the loss, because the best hope had been compromised by a fatal curiosity. The desire to read had become, in one violent moment, a troop carrier for the appetite. Such tragedies crystallized the ethic of caution. What was known could be a weapon if mishandled, and knowledge without discipline became infection. The libraries erected new rules. Only those who had sworn certain oaths could read certain texts. Scribes wore gloves when handling tablets and spoke of lepers as an old form of discipline that might be needed again. The attempts to contain learning were ironic and cruel, for knowledge that might save lives was hidden for fear of becoming a vector of ruin. At the same time, storytellers adapted the catastrophe into new myths that would inform generations. They recast kings as either tragic heroes or monstrous feeders, depending on the need of the community to assign blame or meaning. Songs were sung of brave midwives who refused to abandon the birthing house, of children who outlived their parents by learning to be cautious and kind. These narratives became survival manuals as much as entertainment, teaching listeners how to recognize early symptoms and how to live without attracting needless attention. Not all encounters with the hunger were destructive. There were accounts, remarkable and troubling, of rare individuals who seemed to temper the appetite rather than be consumed by it. They moved among the infected and touched them without becoming prey. Some thought them saints, others called them sorcerers, and some suspected them to be impure. These figures were exceptional and often short-lived, but their existence suggested a peculiarity. The contagion did not behave like a single entity but like a mosaic influenced by many forces. In the courts of ambitious kings, clandestine experiments were authorized. Alchemists and priests were set to work together, mixing metals and incense, blood and salt. Their experiments were grotesque. Animal sacrifices mixed with herbs in iron pots, elixirs tested on prisoners. Sometimes a concoction reduced symptoms, sometimes it had no effect, and sometimes it killed both the patient and the practitioner. The moral cost of such experimentation was high, but desperation made ethics a malleable thing. Meanwhile, the hunger itself evolved. It learned to exploit the strengths of civilizations, turning knowledge into a tool for expansion. Where once it was a consuming fire, it grafted bureaucratic efficiency onto its appetite. The undead administrators did not simply destroy, they recorded. They kept ledgers of those taken and places scouted. The horror of seeing a scribe, once known for his meticulous accounting, continue to tally names with gray fingers became a symbol of the whole inversion of life into ledger and hunger. The changes in warfare were profound. Traditional skirmishes were replaced by operations aimed at severing supply and communication. Siegecraft became more improvisational, less about pounding walls and more about subterfuge and psychological warfare. Sappers used fermented grain to create false feasts and lure hordes into traps. Siege engineers devised collapsing bridges that would snap shut like jaws. The theater of war became a theater of appetite and restraint, where cunning mattered more than numbers. In response, cities reinforced not only walls but social bonds. Neighborhood watch systems were set up with rituals to check on the elderly and the sick. Traders bartered hours of guard duty for portions of barley. In places where neighbors shared labor, appetite had a harder time finding isolated hosts. But these humane measures were uneven, and where they failed, the hunger found easy prey. The lesson hardened: community could be an antidote, but only if its members did not succumb to fear and turn on one another. Amid all this, foreign powers watched and smelled a chance. To the west, merchants with ships and strange dialects considered whether to supply certain cities with arms in exchange for future privileges. Some envoys carried silver and rumors in equal measure. Diplomatic cables, if such a barbaric term could be used, were sent with offers to seal borders or to share intelligence. Many of these proposals were treacherous in their optimism. The hunger had proven itself able to bite through even the most carefully made alliances. The hunger also shaped the arts. Painters, when they could find pigments, depicted scenes of conversion that were at once horrific and beautiful. Statues were defaced and repurposed into trophies. The aesthetic language of siege found its way into pottery and song, and even children began to make toys that mimed the march of undead soldiers, a grim testament to the normalization of atrocity. What started as a defense mechanism became culture, and culture informed the next generation's notions of what was possible and acceptable. In the marsh and in the palace, in the field and in the temple, the hunger found companions in human vice and virtue alike. Greed fed it, but so did fear. Altruism sometimes slowed it, but self-sacrifice could be weaponized by leaders desperate for compliance. The appetite was subtle in learning to make use of complex human social structures, and as it did, it became more than a force of nature. It became a mirror, reflecting the worst and the most resourceful aspects of humanity back at itself. Some historians would later trace a decisive turning point to a siege outside a city with a name that had once meant prosperity. There, a coalition of city-states attempted a gambit. They would starve the hunger by creating an artificial famine, withholding food until the infected could no longer sustain their organized efforts. The plan was brutal and required a patience that few could muster. For months fields lay unharvested by choice, and people who had nothing to do with the contagion suffered alongside those who were part of it. The gambit had results both expected and unforeseen. The hunger's organized units did begin to decay, losing their ability to coordinate as supply lines ran thin. But in that weakening, individual pockets of feral appetite became more dangerous. The axis of power shifted from a centrally organized undead administration to innumerable bands of ravenous humans who had lost any pretense of discipline. The battlefield became a jumble of small horrors rather than a parade of legions. It was then that the war turned personal, and the strategies changed to match the intimacy of the threat. At last, Weary leaders saw that there was no simple strategy that would both protect and preserve civilization in full. Any victory would be partial and require sacrifice. Some rulers declared that their kingdoms would revert to simpler ways, fewer cities, more scattered farms, a deliberate lowering of visibility. They urged citizens to live in smaller clusters, to bury tablets and keep knowledge alive only in codices that could be hidden. Others doubled down on centralization, believing that an iron hand could eradicate the fever by sheer force of will. This divergence birthed two futures cohabiting the same land. One was rural and patchworked, the other concentrated and militarized. Both had merits and both were flawed. In the rural enclaves, a kind of humble wisdom grew, a respect for limits and a reverence for the modest works of hands. In the militarized cities, innovation flourished in grim ways, locks, surveillance, and surgical strikes refined into a specialized craft. Each side learned from the other, sometimes through trade and sometimes through deadly raids. But the hunger did not wait for the neat categories of political scientists. It adapted again, developing methods to spread its influence through ritual and language. It co-opted poetry and rumor, inserting phrases into songs that seemed harmless until chanted in a certain order. These phrases worked like a key in a lock, awakening certain impulses in listeners. The war had mutated into a psycholinguistic battle in which words themselves could become vectors for contagion. Consequently, guardians of speech rose. Priests and scribes developed countertexts, talismans for words meant to blunt the psychological contagion. They wrote blessings into the margins of letters and taught children lullabies that promoted steadiness of mind. These small acts became an essential glue, a cultural inoculation that taught people to be mindful of what they heard and who they trusted. It was not a cure, but it scattered the hunger's influence and saved lives. Within the fortified academies, apprentices learned a new discipline that mixed rhetoric, psychology, and medicine. They trained to recognize the cadences that preceded a conversion and to intervene with voices designed to disarm temptation. They developed signals and scripts to alert communities to danger without spreading the very phrases that would entice the infected. Over time, this profession created a cadre of guardians who could move quietly and steady fragile communities. As the years stretched on, children born into the new order had a different anatomy of fear. They grew accustomed to patrols and to certain rituals of safety. They practiced silence while moving through the dark and learned to string bell ropes that would alert watchmen to the presence of strangers. Yet they also inherited a tenderness for the dead and a compulsion to care for those few bitten who showed a hint of their former selves. The human heart, even under pressure, adapts into forms both ingenious and kind. The hunger continued to claim greatness, and every preserved archive contained names of those who had been consumed or corrupted. The lamentations carved on stele grew into long dirges that recited lists of lost scholars, commanders, and artisans. Grief became a currency in its own right, and mourning rituals took on a combative function, serving as both remembrance and warning for future generations. Those rituals, slow and solemn, knitted communities together under the strain of a persistent outside threat. There were also rumors of allies from beyond the familiar world, traders who spoke of distant islands where strange riders had fought beasts that devoured dreams. Some claimed that foreign shamans carried methods of dampening the hunger, collecting fragments of skyglass that, when smashed, produced a sound that made infected beings restless. Such stories were received with skepticism, but when a band of such strangers showed up with a glass horn and managed to disperse a raiding party, their fame spread with the wind. The leaders were wary of relying on outsiders, yet also ready to adopt any advantage. For all the ingenuity deployed against the hunger, there remained a deeper, metaphysical question: why had appetite taken this form now, in the age of empires, when the rituals of binding and appeasing were well established? Some prophets said it was punishment for hubris, a direct rebuke to kings who had built monuments to themselves. Others thought of it as a consequence of networks. Trade and city life had made humanity into a single, tasty organism. A few scholars proposed that the hunger had always been possible, that it slept in the soil and rose when coaxed by certain conditions. The debate itself was a way for people to feel they had narrative control in a world that had been disordered. Several decisive clashes took place that would be retold for generations as cautionary epic. One battle in a broad valley saw the last organized host of the old order clash with a force that had become an uncanny mirror of their tactics. Infantry met infantry, chariots carved circles in the dust, and archers and slingmen found their petty arts magnified into instruments of annihilation. The strange thing about these encounters was not their scale but their familiarity. Men fought as they always had, only the enemy wore the faces of their fathers and their teachers. Victory in such a battle could mean only temporary salvation because the hunger never yielded a final defeat without a cost. Even after pitched battles, cleanup was a grim ritual. Towns cleared corpses and tried to rebuild the scaffolding of civil life. They planted barley in ruined fields, repaired roofs, and tried to put children back into schools. The process was slow and halting, and sometimes the hunger lay dormant only to flare anew when the complacent loosened their vigilance. Those who had seen regeneration would warn others against the arrogance of believing that a single victory ended the catastrophe. The memory of that early complacency lingered like an old scar. The hunger's interaction with the divine took curious turns. Temples were not merely sites of petition, they became laboratories for the commingling of worship and survival. Priests developed new rites that combined purification and quarantine. Shrinekeepers grew adept at reading subtle signs of infection in a man's gait or in his tone of voice. These domestic prophets became as crucial as physicians, for they provided the social legitimization that permitted community action without despair. An unlikely alliance formed between those who practiced medicine and those who practiced divination. Together they compiled compendia, half empirical and half omenic, that cataloged symptoms alongside interpretations. Some of their entries read like ethical directives, counsel for how to treat a neighbor, instructions for burying the dead, and cautions against the glorification of monsters. This hybrid knowledge was pragmatic and humane, and it survived because it was adaptable to the local cultures that adopted it. As time wore on, certain regions found a brittle stability. A valley might husband its people with hard rules and an efficient watch. Its successes did not translate easily to other places because each settlement's social fabric was different. What worked in one society, tight kin networks, for example, might fail in another where mobility and commerce were central. The hunger thus enforced a kind of cultural diversity by naturally selecting for strategies suited to local constraints. Within the halls of scholars, arguments persisted about the nature of contagion. Some held that the hunger had a material vector, perhaps associated with spores or with a parasite consuming will. Others insisted it was a psychic phenomenon, transmitted by mimicry and language. The debates were not merely academic. They shaped public policy, rationing, and even the design of new fortifications. Pragmatism tended to win out. Until evidence proved otherwise, towns prepared for both material and symbolic infection. There were also acts of individual heroism that seemed almost mundane in their courage. Midwives who refused to abandon labor wards, blacksmiths who worked through the night to fashion locks and hinges, teachers who kept secret classes for children, teaching them manners of silence and alertness. These acts were not overtly dramatic, yet they accumulated into a social armor that was sometimes more effective than armies. History often remembers kings and generals, but in the chronicles of survival, anonymous hands often play the decisive role. Perhaps the most surreal aspect of the era was how rituals adapted to create safe contact with the dead. Where previously the dead had been tended with close hands, communities now developed protocols: a cloth over the mouth, a reed shaft to hold a coin, a simple song to accompany the body to its grave. Funerals shortened and became more utilitarian, but they preserved the human instinct to honor those gone before. In that preservation, people found a continuity that allowed culture to endure despite monstrous pressures. In the field of craft, innovation was driven by necessity. Artisans produced specialized garments that could be sealed to protect against bodily contact. Architects designed walls with narrow sally ports that could be sealed quickly and opened slowly to minimize risk. Even pottery changed: jars designed to hold sounds so that messages could be passed without human breath directly contacting the receiver. These small inventions changed daily life, adding layers of caution that would seem excessive to those born before the hunger. Diplomacy, once performed in crowded halls with ambassadors and banquets, transformed into a game of proxies and discreet signals. Envoys used coated cloths and distant fires to propose terms and alliances. Treaties were sealed with tokens and left at crossroads rather than discussed face to face. This distance altered the texture of agreements. These pacts often lacked the warmth of handshakes and thus were fragile, but they were necessary in a world where human proximity could be fatal. A generation of leaders emerged who knew only a world shaped by the hunger's presence. They were practical and harsh, judged less by their eloquence than by their capacity to maintain supply lines and keep watch. Their tombs later bore inscriptions that were blunt chronicles of endurance. Some saw redemption in grand projects meant to bind communities together, public granaries and collective wells, while others built monuments to power. Both impulses were rooted in a single desire to make the world safer for those who followed. Even religion did not remain static. New syncretic cults arose that blended old gods and the new ethics of caution. They taught that sacredness could be embodied in acts of restraint as much as in bloodletting. Shrines to that ethic grew beside rivers and at crossroads, offering a place for people to swear oaths of solidarity and thus build moral bulwarks against the hunger. These moral reforms did more to hold communities together than any fortress could, because they shaped behavior at a microscopic level. There were attempts to turn the hunger back into a weapon. Some rulers tried to weaponize infected troops against rival factions, only to discover that the appetite could not be controlled. It would often devour both friend and foe until there was nothing left to command. Such projects ended catastrophically, reinforcing the lesson that a weaponized plague is a malign force that defies ownership. The lesson burned into the collective memory that some tools are too dangerous to wield. As centuries passed, the region's demography changed. Cities shrank and rebounded in waves. Language shifted subtly as refugees from different dialects mingled and created pidgins that could function under stress. New oral traditions emerged to teach children the codes of silence and the songs that kept them calm in times of alarm. These cultural evolutions smoothed daily life in a world still haunted by old terrors, allowing people to live without the constant expectation of oblivion. In the archaeological record centuries hence, future diggers would find layers of habitation separated by thick ash and by the striated lines of hurried rebuilding. They would uncover tablets with laments carved into them in a certain hurried hand, and jars that had been sealed with prayers. Those artifacts would speak not only to devastation but to resilience. What they would not reveal so easily was the intimate mathematics of fear, the small negotiations, the whispered bargains, the tiny acts of kindness that prolonged lives. There were, finally, movements of philosophical reflection that tried to account for what the hunger had done to the concept of human nature. Thinkers posited that appetite had been a formative engine of civilization. After all, the need to feed had spurred agriculture, trade, and law. The hunger forced them to ask whether that engine could be both creator and destroyer. Some concluded that humanity's greatness lay in its ability to create institutions that channeled appetite into productive ends, while others argued that appetite remained a possible source of ruin when untethered by ethical constraints. The long aftermath saw new balances. Empires rose and fell, as they always had, but they did so with a new humility engraved into their laws. The hunger was never fully eradicated, rather it was integrated into a vigilance that shaped law, ritual, and daily life. The people learned to live with an absence that could not be entirely filled, an awareness that appetite, when left to its own devices, could remake the world into an endless night. Out of this recognition came a deeper communal ethic that would be recited to children as a kind of prayer against complacency. In quiet moments, survivors would tell stories of a time when a man could walk into a crowded square and be certain he would meet a friend or a rival and not a hollow imitation wearing a familiar face. These stories were not merely nostalgic. They were admonitions and maps. They taught that vigilance is not mere paranoia but a kind of love for the collective future. In the telling, people preserved not only facts but the moral grammar necessary to ensure that hunger never again gained the upper hand. And so the memory of those dark years remained stitched into the fabric of Mesopotamia, a testament to both human frailty and inventiveness. The hunger had done what few other forces could. It had turned social structures inside out and forced a rethinking of power, community, and the sacred. From that crucible came societies that, while scarred, were also remarkably adaptive. They had learned that the truest defense against an appetite that consumed identity was to cultivate practices that nourished it in healthier forms. Generations later, bards would still sing dirges that invoked the old hunger as a moral allegory. Their songs were not simple lamentations, they were tools for education. Each verse warned of the dangers of pride and the fragility of institutions, and each chorus taught practical wisdom, how to watch, how to care for the vulnerable, and how to bind knowledge so it could not become poison. The memory of the hunger thus became an instrument of civic instruction, a cultural immune system designed to inoculate future souls against a recurrence. In the end, the Epic of Assyrian Nightmares functioned as both a cautionary tale and a record of perseverance. The hunger had revealed weaknesses in empires and exposed moral failures in rulers, but it had also generated untold acts of courage and care. The landscape of Mesopotamia would never be quite the same again, and nor would the human heart. Yet the endurance of its peoples proved that even when appetite becomes a force that can mimic gods, communities can reforge their bonds and find ways to survive and remember. Even now, when the winds pass over the ruins and lift the dust of former palaces, a listener can almost hear the whisper of those ancient tablets being read aloud. The breath of those narratives is part lament and part instruction, a winding litany that urges future generations to be watchful and kind. In the shadow of temples and in the tumble of ruins, the story of appetite remains alive, a story of hunger, of empire, and of the stubborn capacity of humans to build meaning out of catastrophe. Long before empires razed their brick and reed into the dust, before names like Babylon and Uruk had weight enough to carve into history, a rumor came down from a world beyond the sky, an infection that ate not only flesh but legend. It arrived as a rumor because even rain that fell in measured sheets cannot entirely drown the impossible. It sneaks in through cracks, via travelers with fevered tongues and sailors who dreamt of dead faces looking back at them from the black water. The rumor spoke of warriors who should not have been, of once kind souls turned to hunger, of a hunger that spread quicker than the wheat rust under a hot sun. The people of Mesopotamia had songs for every calamity, and they learned a new cadence to hold this one, a slow, steady chant at the edges of sleep. The story that took root in clay tablets and oral recitations did not begin with gods or kings, but with a rupture in the sky, a rent of shimmering light that appeared over the Persian Gulf as if the sea itself had been torn. Traders on longboats first saw things like pinpricks of heat, like falling stars that moved like thought rather than meteor. Then objects came through that light, objects that should not have been able to cross oceans or time, bringing with them an invisible contagion that attached itself to breath and blood. Villagers who traded spices with far ports noticed strange sores on sailors and a pallor like cold moonlight when the market closed. In the city-states along the rivers, priests consulted omens and read entrails, their fingers stained with oil and wine. They called in wise women from reed huts, scribes from temples, astrologers from the ziggurats, yet their answers were small and trembling when measured against the scale of the thing. They wrapped their fears in myth to make them easier to touch. Perhaps an old god had returned jealous of human life. Perhaps the dead reclaimed what they had been denied. Still, even wrapped in myth, the terror was practical, because the first turned victims begged, and then they rose again with empty eyes and a new appetite that why the elders had no answer for. The early changes were small and terrible. A hunter came back to his village with a fever. He coughed and spoke nonsense of a puppet market at sea. Neighbors nursed him with milk and broth until they found that his hands could not be soothed by touch. He, like others, stopped sleeping whole. Instead, he wandered the streets at night, sometimes hum, sometimes wail, and he bit the hand that tried to soothe him. Those bitten found themselves changed over a matter of days, and a new rumor followed that bite like shadow follows a man at dusk. News traveled along rivers and caravan tracks with a stubbornness born of fright. The ziggurat scribes wrote an urgent set of clay tablets to a neighboring king, a king who collected omens as carefully as he collected taxes. His priests translated the symptoms into portents. The stars had swallowed false light, the god of death had nothing left to offer, and the underworld breathed differently. The king ordered a cordon of soldiers, but the soldiers were men and not protectors of fate. They returned to their barracks carrying not only spears but the soft moans of those they patrolled. The infection ignored policy and border, and laws were of no use when confronted with the cold of someone who had ceased to be themselves. Stories of impossible figures began to circulate in hushed voices, those figures wearing the silhouettes of those known to the people but moved by currents that were not their own. Some said the infection took the strength of a god and twisted it into something profane. Others said it was a sickness from another world, borne by travelers who hailed from beyond the known heavens. Whatever the cause, the infected did not simply die. They became carriers of a different fate, a contagion that spread through touch and breath, through moonside promises and market brawls alike. The first few city-states collapsed not by siege or famine but by the steady gnaw of their own bodies turning against their will. As the infection spread, narratives shifted from whisper to cautionary tale, and new heroes were summoned into being by people whose lives were narrowed to a single purpose: hold back the tide. Among them were warriors whose names would later be carved into stone by those who survived, men and women who learned to read the signs of the changed and to kill without feeling the weight of personal failure. They bound themselves with oaths taken under stars and oil, and they made devices from bronze and reed to help them repel the touched. Yet what made them legendary was not just their courage but their imagination, the willingness to confront the unfamiliar with tools of adaptation. One of these champions was a bowman from the marshes whose aim could find the smallest gap in a reed basket. He watched as the infection claimed his brother and then his neighbors, and he taught his hands to shoot with the steadiness of someone who had been counted on all his life. He led raiding parties at dawn when the light was thin and the changed were slowest, and he developed tactics of distance and silence, using the river mist to mask movements and the reed beds to catch sounds. Others learned from him. Hunters became sentinels, fishermen became watchmen, and women who spun wool by the hearth became the ones who smeared bitter herbs on doorways to mask scent. Their resistance was not merely military, it was cultural, a weaving together of survival from the remnants of everyday life. In the halls of power, kings held councils that lasted long into the nights, running their hands through beards and listening to scribes read their own trembling inscriptions. Some favored isolation, sealing city gates with mud and mortar as if closing a lid could suffocate the thing without. Others argued for aggressive action, for pursuing the infected back into the ruins they crawled from and burning their houses and parchments together until nothing remained. The debates were fierce, because isolation starved trade and burned wealth, while assault invited more touch and risk. The political choices were the same as in any plague: who to save, who to sacrifice, and how to hold the people together when the very idea of community became dangerous. As normalcy crumbled, new rituals were invented to keep families from accidentally embracing what would undo them. Mothers learned gestures of refusal, faces learned to read the smallest tell of early conversion. The touch of a grandfather grew forbidden, and children learned to knot their love into words and gifts left at thresholds. Temples adapted, too. Priests developed purification rites that smelled of bitter herbs and smoke, and they consecrated thresholds with amulets to be tucked under sleeping mats. People bartered faith for small moral frameworks that allowed them to do what must be done without unraveling themselves entirely. The infection did not have a single shape. In some places it seemed to mimic the dead, in others it mimicked the living, and in still others it absorbed traits like a mirror absorbing light. There were reports of artists who, struck by the illness, painted with fevered hands and produced staggering portraits that captured the moment of death more lovingly than any living painter could. The infected retained skill sometimes, recalling the songs they had sung and the prayers they had intoned, which made them more terrifying because they moved with an eerie memory of who they had been. In marketplaces, once beloved servants staggered and hummed songs that meant nothing yet made whole families break down, because the melody was the same lullaby that had soothed infants for generations. It was in this liminal climate, where myth and fear braided tighter each day, that tales began of something more organized than random contagion, a central mind or a cosmic accident that had the cunning to plan. Survivors spoke of a force that corralled the changed like a herd, guiding them in waves against the embattled walls of cities. Some called it the hunger given form, others thought a god had stitched together compassion and malice to create an entity that was both judge and executioner. Scholars who later studied those clay tablets argued about whether the force existed in any meaningful way beyond human projection, and whether people had always needed a face to aim their courage at so they would not scatter like wheat before the wind. Whether or not a central mind existed, organized groups of the change did begin to cohere, and their patterning looked disturbingly strategic. Waves of attack came at twilight when sentries shifted and rested, and then again at dawn when the city was weakest with exhaustion. The defenders learned in brutal cycles, repel them now, and 3 days later be haunted by a new method of probing the walls. The siege became not merely a contest of stone but a test of memory and the speed of learning. Those who adapted faster survived to tell the tale. The narrative of Mesopotamia's last stand is as much a story of human learning as it is of loss. Into this maelstrom strode certain visitors who can only be called mythic because their deeds folded so neatly into the epics that followed. They were not purely human nor purely God, and their arrival renewed an old pattern of how Mesopotamians understood crisis. The cosmos would always bend around acts of exceptional courage. One such figure was a woman named Nineveh, a former temple clerk who taught herself anatomy from old clay tablets and then applied that knowledge to the battlefield. She recognized early that the infection altered not the name but the function of things, that it sought metabolic processes as much as movement, and she began to experiment with treatments that were half science and half prayer. Nineveh and others like her did not act alone. They formed ragged guilds of surgeons and priests, artisans and oracles, welding their particular knowledge into techniques that could both heal and end suffering. They traded recipes for poultices and murmured confidences, testing them on the marginally touched and learning through the painful calculus of trial and error. Her group learned that cooling baths and strong bitter decoctions slowed the progression in some, that whispered prayers sometimes soothed the errant memories enough to make people cooperative during treatment, and that swift, merciful death was a gift in many cases. These were not clean technologies, they bore the marks of improvisation and ethical compromise, and they produced both miracles and horror in equal measure. As the infection widened into a regional catastrophe, refugees poured from smaller towns into the walled cities where resources were already strained. The social fabric of those cities altered, markets became quieter, and the trade caravans that once stretched like caterpillars through the desert became sparse and heavily armed. The influx of bodies forced new ways of organizing daily life. Rationing systems appeared, as did night watches that rotated among families. People turned to storytelling more avidly, for a tale could shape the fears of a community and make them manageable. Bards adapted their songs to the new times, weaving cautionary stanzas into love lyrics and lullabies, ensuring that wisdom passed with music as easily as water passed through a sieve. Yet even steady systems could be undermined by betrayal or desperation. In some cities, guards took bribes to look the other way, and in others, leaders fell into paralysis under the weight of impossible choices. Family units became canny leaders, sometimes harming strangers to save their own, and sometimes abandoning their own for a chance at safety. The moral tapestry of Mesopotamia's last stand was thus stitched with contradictory threads. Selflessness and selfishness were both survival strategies, and both had their costs. Songs would later remember heroes and traitors in equal measure, because the need for nuance and memory outlasts any single political judgment. There were moments of pure, human heroism that cut through the fear like knives through reed mats. A baker who used his ovens not to bake bread but to cremate the bodies of the fallen without apology, making sure that no contagion could devour the city through the alleys. A musician who played a soft song every night to soothe children whose parents had been taken. The music became a small ritual of normalcy in an otherwise fractured world. And there were countless nameless acts, a woman offering a bowl of water to a tired guard, an old seamstress stitching protective mouthed cloths for a troop of medics. These details, minute and unglamorous, were the mortar that kept the last weeks from dissolving into chaos entirely. As the months dragged, the landscape of warfare changed. No longer were battles waged only at walls and gates. They happened in grain stores at midnight, and cisterns at dawn, and on temple steps during holy days. The changed learned the rhythms of human routine and struck when ritual and habit left a city weakest. The defenders responded by creating rituals of their own, feigned cures to draw the infected into traps, double watches, and the development of gray teams who favored dusk operations when the changed were less coordinated. The ebb and flow of violence became coordinated improvisation. Those who were most flexible had the best chances of surviving into another season. The gods of Mesopotamia watched, or the people said they watched, and their priests fashioned theological responses that mixed fear and strategy. Some temples declared the scourge of punishment and called for propitiation, piling offerings larger and stranger than before. Other cults argued the gods were testing their adherents, and they urged endurance and cunning as the highest form of worship. Yet another strain of thought argued that the gods had been blindsided by this foreign contagion and lacked the traditional mechanisms to manage it, which meant humans had to act like gods themselves. Each interpretation had social consequences. It shaped how the afflicted were treated, who was admitted to sanctuary, and which moral lines could be crossed. While the living argued, a different narrative grew among those who had survived the earliest onslaughts: the need to understand. Scholars and curious minds scavenged libraries and clay records, looking for precedents of sudden life return or mass hysteria. They compared omens and star charts, looking for correlations between celestial phenomena and outbreaks, and some of their notes survive as fragments on shattered tablets. Those records show a sophisticated attempt to think causally rather than merely theologically, and it was this nascent science that would later allow effective countermeasures. In the moment, however, it was slow work, and speed was often the currency of survival. One of the most harrowing seasons came when the infection found its way to a temple that housed a storied relic said to bind death itself. The temple, a hub of pilgrims and trade, exploded into chaos overnight, and the contagion moved faster than the temple's wards could handle. Priests tried, then failed, to hold the sanctuaries closed, and the relic was moved into secret storage by those desperate to save it. Some said its removal produced a new curse, some said it saved the few who remained. The debate raged long after the ashes cooled. Was it hubris to trust relics over action, and did misplaced faith cost many their lives? That argument is as old as Mesopotamia itself, and it surfaced again in this crisis with renewed ferocity. In response to losses like this, a new kind of military order emerged, less a royal standing force and more a coalition of the willing. Healers who could hold swathes of the infected at bay while slingers and archers targeted nodes of organization. They called themselves by many names, but in the mud of songs and tablets they were remembered as the keepers of threshold. They specialized in slow siege tactics, in quarantines that were brutal but effective, and in humane executions that minimized suffering. Their methods were criticized for ruthlessness, but viewed from the vantage of survival, they were instruments that saved entire neighborhoods from the fangs of contagion. Among the keepers of threshold there was one who stood out, a man who had once been a scholar of distant lands and who had, by a mixture of sorrow and stubborn insight, come to believe that this contagion was neither wholly natural nor entirely divine. He suspected a cosmic strand to it, an influence that warped life nearer the edges of the known world. He organized teams to map the incursions, tracking not just bodies and bites but the patterns of movement as if the infection were a migrating animal. Their maps were crude, etched in soot and wet clay, but they revealed corridors of movement, riverways, and coastal stretches where the change gathered and from which attacks originated. It was this movement that tied most tightly into the eventual theory that the contagion had come through openings in the sky. People had seen ships bearing strange artifacts and seen the lights that made men sick, and they began to theorize that a dimensional tear had leaked more than objects. It had leaked a condition, like a rot from elsewhere. The scholars' theory was not universally accepted, but it inspired a risky strategy. Instead of only holding the defensive, they would trace the contagion's edges and attempt to close the points where it emerged. Closing a wound in the world was a metaphor, yes, but metaphors can inspire practical work, so they built nests of watchtowers and sent teams to monitor the shores where the first lights had fallen. The campaigns to follow were grueling and often desperate. Teams sent to the shoreline found strange wreckage and odd residue, not of this land's metallurgy but of a composition none of them could name. Some of this material burned like cold flame, leaving marks on the hands of those who touched it. The teams had to improvise protective gear from leather and woven reeds, and they learned to work in silence and in thickly layered clothing to avoid any contact. Their mission rarely rewarded them with clear success. Sometimes they returned with small victories and maps that showed not a closure but a slow sidestep, a pushing back of the infected's tide. As campaigns continued, the myth-science blend grew into a full culture of resistance with its own rites, talismans, and terminology, which later historians would call a defensive mythology. Its adherents used both song and empiricism, chanting to steady the hands while measuring the effectiveness of a bitter poultice to produce knowledge in the middle of ruin. This blending is one reason why so many of the stories from that era sound mythic and yet feel precise, as if someone had taken a recipe for a stew and transmuted it into a sacrament. It is crucial to remember that in times of existential threat, people will often convert pragmatic knowledge into ritual because rituals ensure memory and reproducibility across generations. By the second year of the outbreak, the landscape of Mesopotamia had been irrevocably altered. Villages once humming with loomwork and pottery fell silent, and whole stretches of farmland lay fallow, either because their humans had been taken or because the change had settled in open places and made them unsafe. Wildlife felt the change too. Migratory birds altered their paths, and wolves and other scavengers grew bolder at the edges of abandoned fields. The ecosystem bore the marks of human catastrophe, and in turn it made survival more complicated. Starvation and pestilence introduced secondary crises that forced leaders to choose which disaster to tackle first. Yet humans are stubborn in ways animals are not. They find habits of hope. Irrigation lines were repaired where possible, and communal gardens were cultivated within walls to reduce exposure. The survivors learned to grow crops that matured quickly, to store barley in pots wrapped in oil to deter pests, and to keep livestock minimal and close to guard towers. Children learned new games that trained them in stealth and alertness, not merely for play but as practical preparation for the world they would inherit. Those things, gardens, watchtowers, children's games, were the daily acts of defiance that stitched life back onto its fragile frame. Over time, the change themselves evolved in surprising ways. Where earlier they had been driven by a simple hunger, some pockets began to show emergent behaviors, cooperative hunting strategies, and in some troubling cases, a crude mimicry of social organization. They organized raids that displayed pattern and timing beyond random chance, suggesting that whatever animated them could learn and adapt. These developments frightened people more than anything else, because they suggested not merely degradation but a new form of intelligence born from decay. The defenders responded with sharper tactics, traps that collapsed the infected's formations and tactics designed to starve clusters rather than combat them directly. One heartbreaking consequence of prolonged exposure to the changed was the moral erosion that accompanies long warfare. People began to justify horrific measures as necessary, forced removals, tests that targeted the marginal, and executions performed on the say-so of those in power. Some leaders hardened into tyrants, using the pretense of necessity to cement power. Others broke under the moral weight and abdicated. These fractures added a political complexity to the crisis, because an external threat often amplifies internal tendencies toward centralization. The myths that later told of wise rulers and wicked usurpers were not tiny dichotomies, they were messy, and their truth lies in the gray. Despite the bleakness, seeds of art and memory continue to grow in war-scorched soil. Poets wrote epics that wove the new reality into the fabric of their language, creating metaphors that could carry the memory forward. Sculptors made small talismans that honored those who tried to hold back the change, and these artifacts were hidden in walls and under altars, meant to be found by descendants who might need their courage. Memory became a deliberate craft, because to remember was to keep alive the strategies and ethics that had saved others. The act of remembering was itself a form of resistance to the erasure the changed sought to bring. In the third year, a decisive set of campaigns shifted the balance in ways that would decide survival for many cities. These campaigns combined the scholarly mapping and the brutal military techniques into a coherent theater of action. Teams of keepers and soldiers coordinated with fishermen, traders, and shrine workers to close off coastal points, to burn the strange wreckage, and to erect barriers made of stone and salted reed that confused the contagion's scent. Many of these operations were costly, some failed miserably and cost hundreds of lives. But the successful operations were enough to push pockets of infection into a slow dormancy, not death, but a kind of stasis that allowed living communities to breathe. The stasis that followed was uneasy and fragile. The contagion did not vanish, it lay dormant in ruins and in lonely wilds, and slow-simmering pockets that could flare again. The survivors learned to live with this new normal, cultivating a watchfulness as natural as breathing. They developed long-term strategies, regular patrols across vulnerable corridors, the training of young people in containment techniques, and the diffusion of basic medical knowledge so that every household could act as a first line of defense. Civilization adapted by making vigilance a daily habit, and vigilance became woven into festivals and calendar rituals so it would not be neglected in times of complacency. The theology of the period also transformed in response to the new shape of life. Some cults collapsed under the weight of the failure of their propitiations, others reformed themselves as organizations of practical aid, administering medicine and shelter rather than merely performing ritual sacrifice. This secularization of temple function made them hubs of recovery, places where pragmatic knowledge and spiritual consolation coalesced. In some cases, temples that had once hoarded resources began open distributions to stabilize their cities, recognizing that hoarded wealth was worse than any sin during a plague. These adaptations would influence the region's social contract for generations to come. As years passed into a decade, a cultural shift occurred. The once feared change became part of legend in a different way, one that allowed people to speak of them without collapsing into fear. They were no longer merely enemies to be destroyed but cautionary figures, reminders of hubris, of the fragile line between the living and the unliving. Storytellers painted them in countless shades, sometimes monstrous, sometimes pitiable, sometimes bizarrely human. These narratives gave the living a vocabulary for grief and guilt, allowing communities to reckon with their actions during the worst of the outbreak. The memory work continued beyond mere stories. Schools, whether informal in courtyards or more structured in temple complexes, began to teach what had been learned: how to treat early symptoms, how to organize watch rotations, and how to make the protective cloths that had saved so many lives. The curriculum was a mosaic of trial, ritual, and observation, designed to produce citizens who were capable of both empathy and self-defense. This education planted a cultural defense as potent as any wall, passing down the lesson that vigilance paired with compassion produced resilience. Trade slowly returned across some routes, but never to its former ease. Merchants traveled in convoys now, with hymns and songs to mask the scent of fear, and they carried with them not only goods but the protocols of containment. Ports developed decontamination rituals that involved both salt baths and prayers, and traders paid handsomely for the security these rituals bought. Economic life resumed in fits and starts, but it bore the mark of its trauma. Contracts and agreements were written with clauses that dealt with contamination and quarantine. This legal codification of memory made the past a discipline rather than merely a tale. One of the lasting legacies of the crisis was the way in which it reshaped the relationship between cities and their hinterlands. Cities that had once relied on distant villages for food recognized that they needed to reintegrate those villages into defensive networks, supporting them rather than extracting wealth. This led to a kind of proto-welfare system: grain reserves, shared watch rotations, and mutual aid pacts. In return, villages offered manpower and knowledge of the local terrain, making the whole network more robust. This negotiation altered the political shape of the region, empowering local leaders who could orchestrate cooperation rather than command obedience. Remnants of the infection persisted in remote enclaves long after the great campaigns had succeeded in the heartlands. Mountain caves and marshy backwaters occasionally harbored the changed, and small raiding parties would flay out and be rebuffed. These persistent pockets became the raw material of myth: the haunted valley, the cursed spring. Travelers told tales of wandering figures, pale and silent, and the stories served as caution for new generations. Yet with those tales also came a note of compassion. The changed were, after all, once people, and the myths allowed for that remembrance even when survival required firm action. The social memory of the outbreak influenced law and custom. Some legal codes took up provisions about the treatment of the afflicted, and punishments were structured to prevent vigilantism and to safeguard public health. Courts debated the morality of quarantine, the permissibility of lethal force against the infected, and the rights of those who had been exposed but not transformed. These debates matured into legal statutes that framed how future crises would be handled, embedding lessons into the governance that would outlast individual lives. In that way, the crisis rechanneled personal tragedy into institutional learning. As decades became centuries, the story of the outbreak blended into the broader epic of Mesopotamia. Chroniclers wrote of the Age of Ashes with a mixture of horror and admiration for the endurance of those who had rebuilt. Historians, priests, and poets disagreed about specifics, about whether the contagion had cosmic origin or not, but they all agreed on the moral: resilience was forged in the crucible of cooperation. The memory of those times became a moral compass, invoked by leaders who sought to show their willingness to sacrifice for the common good, or by poets urging society to remember humility before the unknown. There were later attempts by scholars from other lands to analyze what had happened, and they proposed theories that ranged from the metaphysical to the proto-scientific. Some posited extraterrestrial contagions, others blamed ancient sorceries. Archaeologists in later eras found physical traces: charred bays of boats, strange metallic shards embedded in soils, clay tablets with frantic script. and pieced together fragments of evidence that never fully satisfied curiosity. The ambiguity preserved the event as part of the imagination as much as the archive, allowing it to continue to instruct and haunt across generations. Perhaps the most profound legacy of the outbreak was ethical. It forced societies to answer profound questions about community, sacrifice, and the nature of compassion. How do you care for a neighbor who might be a threat? When is mercy tyranny? Who is owed the last scraps of bread when rationing begins? The answers chosen in those dusty decades shaped institutions and habits that would outlast the immediate crisis. Societies became, by necessity, more deliberative about these moral quandaries, practicing the difficult balancing act between self-preservation and solidarity. Not all lessons were learned at once or universally. In some regions, the old habits returned with a vengeance, and complacency bred fresh vulnerability. Outbreaks recur in human history because people forget. That is why the deliberate rituals and the educational systems the survivors created were more than memory, they were insurance against forgetfulness. The stories of the keepers and Nineveh's remedies were retold not as mere entertainment but as canonical instruction, part of a rough and honest civic liturgy. In the end, the story of Mesopotamia's struggle with the changed is not just about survival but about the reshaping of meaning in a world where the boundaries between life and death had been asked to shift. The experience forced a reframing of how people thought of personhood. A person was not merely a body but a node in a web of relationships whose health had global consequences. This insight made communities less likely to treat outsiders as expendable and more likely to cultivate networks of care. From ashes came a new myth, one in which the final stand was not merely a heroic last battle but an ongoing practice of mutual care and vigilance. Even the arts carried the aftereffects into eternity. Sculptures carved in later generations took motifs of locked doors and opened hands, signifying both protection and offering. Poets used the changed as metaphors for political decay, for the hunger of empire, and for the quiet despair that visits every household. These cultural echoes kept the lessons alive, ensuring that when new challenges arose, the phrasing of memory could be consulted for wisdom. In this way, the catastrophic experience was folded into the cultural DNA of the region. Stories also circulated beyond the original heartlands, borne by traders and refugees who carried the tale like pottery in their caravans. It arrived in courts far away as a warning about the limits of dominion and the necessity of humility. Kings and priests in the outskirts who heard the story adapted their practices, built protocols, and sometimes invoked the story to justify policies of inclusion and mutual aid. Thus the myth traveled, diffusing across the ancient Near East and influencing not only local custom but regional politics and theology. Generations later, when businessmen of the steppes and scribes of far courts spoke of that age of ashes, they did so with a mixture of reverence and practicality. They crafted codes that would survive their own lifetimes, designed to keep another contagion from ravaging a civilization. The tangible results, granaries built in multiple locations, watch systems standardized, and education about quarantine, were the most direct inheritance. The intangible results, the way a people rethought duty and neighbor, were perhaps the deeper legacy. Across time, relics began to accumulate around that narrative, items rescued from ruins, amulets made from strange alloys, and treatises in clumsy script describing bitter tinctures. These artifacts were both sacred and sober reminders, displayed in temples and private homes to remind people that the thin line between past and present had been crossed and then secured again. Pilgrims came to these places not for miracles but for education, to learn how ancestors had kept the city alive when it teetered on the edge. The sites became living classrooms as well as memorials, embedding the memory of action into the landscape. Of course, history does not end neatly, and the change continued, in small and localized forms, to be a part of the world. They served as a perennial terror, a possibility that stalked memory. But they also served as a cautionary spur, ensuring that for as long as the memory persisted, institutions tended toward preparedness. People who lived centuries later were taught to check the coastal lights, to seal breaches of strange material, to watch for fevered sailors who muttered nonsense into the night. This vigilance was the quiet triumph of the survivors. They turned horror into knowledge and then into policy. There is another thread often overlooked in the grand historiography, the personal stories of those who loved and lost, and who then rebuilt their lives in small, intimate ways. Lovers separated by quarantine and reunited after months, parents who lost children and still found ways to nurture others, friends who held hands to the last. These human-scale narratives give the broad sweep its emotional gravity, because histories of systems can sometimes wash out the faces of those caught in them. The memory of affection and grief preserved in songs and small inscriptions is what made the cultural response humane rather than merely efficient. As centuries accumulated, some cultures anthropomorphized the changed into moral allegories, representations of greed, of empire, of the memory of failed devotion. They became metaphors and sermons that instructed rulers on the dangers of ignoring the edges of society. But others treated them with a mournful tenderness, reminding communities that these were once neighbors and that compassion had been wielded as a tool of policy as much as an act of mercy. This duality kept the moral imagination nimble, refusing easy moral verdicts and instead encouraging constant questioning. Finally, the tale of Mesopotamia's last stand against the change teaches a broader lesson about how civilizations learn from trauma. Where the initial reaction was chaos and myth, it evolved into disciplined action and then into ritualized memory. The sequence reveals how human societies fuse myth-making and practical reasoning into survival mechanisms. Memory becomes policy, policy becomes ritual, and ritual becomes culture. Each stage preserves lessons in different forms so that they remain accessible across generations. If you listen to the old songs, if you allow the rhythm of their stanzas to soak into your ear, you will hear the cadence of those who lived through the Age of Ashes. The refrain is not triumphalism but continuity, a vow not to repeat the failures of the past, an acceptance that vulnerability is part of life, and a promise to protect the fragile warmth of the living from the coldness of what they left behind. The final stand of Mesopotamia was never a single battle but a long sequence of choices, a culture choosing, again and again, to care for one another even when caring endangered the caregiver. That is the true legacy of the time, an ethic turned into habit, a habit turned into law, a law turned into myth, and a myth that taught generations how to live. And so the story moves on, carried by winds and merchants, whispered by teachers to bright-eyed children, and recorded by scribes whose hands trembled as they pressed clay against letters. Each retelling changes the shape of the narrative slightly, emphasizing one lesson over another: vigilance, compassion, coordination, or the humility to accept that sometimes the world offers threats that cannot be fully understood. In each version there is a common core, the memory of human perseverance braided with sorrow. That braided memory is the marrow of many later civilizations' moral bones. It is worth ending not with a final conclusion but with an invitation to remember that the past is not simply an object of curiosity but a bank of strategies and ethical experiments. The people of ancient Mesopotamia passed on more than stories. They left practical blueprints for living in a world where the boundaries of the known can be pierced. Their experience teaches that when faced with the unnameable, Humans must create names and actions, rituals of preparedness that are equal parts science, craft, and song. Those who learn this are better equipped to face whatever strange lights might fall again from the sky. Subscribe if you dare to step into the Marvel Zombies universe, and comment which Avenger you'd trust when the world turns undead.